Let's be honest. When you think of ancient Egypt, chances are your mind immediately goes to the big stuff: pyramids, pharaohs, the Sphinx glaring across the desert like it knows secrets it'll never share. Maybe a gold sarcophagus or two, or Cleopatra with her dramatic eyeliner. The monumental, the royal, the grand. And fair enough, they were good at that. But if you peel back the hieroglyphs and look past the limestone facades, there's another story buried underneath all that glitter, a quieter one, one without titles or crowns, without thrones or sacred bloodlines. This is the story of the people who hauled the stone, who planted the barley, who brewed the beer, raised the children, and prayed to gods whose names might not even be remembered today. It's their lives we're here to talk about, because for every pharaoh etched into history, there were tens of thousands of ordinary souls who got up every morning and went about their work, baking bread, fishing the Nile, thatching roofs under the hot sun. They lived, they laughed, they argued over goats and grain, and yes, they probably got annoyed with their kids for tracking mud into the house. They were real, and honestly, their lives were just as interesting as any king's. So, what was it actually like to be one of them? Let me walk you through it. Before we jump into who did what and how the economy worked, let's just land in the place for a moment. Imagine standing barefoot in a patch of tilled earth. The soil is damp from the seasonal flooding of the Nile, a smell that's earthy and rich, like wet bark and crushed grass. There's a hum in the air, not from machines, but from insects and wind through papyrus reeds. A child runs by, chasing a goat. You hear women laughing near a grinding stone, pounding grain into flour with a thump-thump rhythm that's older than language. It's not quiet, not really, but it's calm, rhythmic, predictable, in a way that life today rarely feels. The sun isn't just above you, it owns the sky. It presses down on your shoulders like a warm hand, firm and constant. You get used to it, even when it burns. Everyone does. And that river, it's everything. See, the Nile wasn't just a river, it was a lifeline, the very reason Egypt existed. Every year, it would flood like clockwork, dumping nutrient-rich silt across the valley. That mud made farming possible in one of the driest regions on Earth. Without it, Egypt would have been just more desert. With it, it became the breadbasket of the ancient world. So, when we talk about the people of Egypt, we're really talking about people of the Nile. Farmers followed its cycles the way we follow calendars now. Children learned its moods like you'd learn your dad's voice from across the house. Fishermen read the water's ripples like a book. It was a constant presence, sometimes friend, sometimes threat. Even death ran along its banks. We'll absolutely get to temples, tombs, and rituals. You can't ignore the spiritual side of Egyptian life. But this isn't a story about kings ordering pyramids. It's about the guy hauling limestone in the heat, and the woman grinding barley for beer that'd feed an entire work crew. It's about sweat and sore backs and calloused hands. And it's not all toil and struggle either. Egyptians were surprisingly fun. They told dirty jokes on papyrus scrolls. They threw festivals that lasted for days. They danced, drank, flirted, and raised pets. Cats, yeah, but also monkeys, and even trained falcons if you could afford one. They weren't just survivors in a harsh land. They were creators, innovators, believers. And they had dreams, just like we do. Some wanted better pay. Some wanted to be scribes instead of servants. Some just wanted their kids to outlive them. And well, some probably wanted a little peace and quiet after a long day in the fields. So why focus on them? Why spend 50,000 words on the baker instead of the builder of empires? Because history has a bad habit of forgetting the people who make it possible. We know the names of rulers and generals, but it's the nameless millions who held things together. Without them, no pyramid would have been built, no grain shipped, no gods fed with offerings. And there's something deeply human about that, isn't there? Their world may feel distant, hieroglyphs and canopic jars, gods with falcon heads, but at its core, it's a world we'd recognize. Families, food, love, grief, the ache in your knees after a long day, and the sigh of relief when the work is finally done. Maybe we're not so different after all. This documentary-style journey will take you through every corner of ancient Egyptian life, not through textbooks or museum plaques, but through imagined footsteps. You'll get to know the rhythm of village mornings, the taste of an everyday meal, and the social codes of work crews and temple festivals. We'll meet farmers rising before the sun to catch the cool air, builders muttering under their breath at overseers with whips, women trading gossip at communal ovens, children playing beside irrigation canals with frogs and mud balls, old priests mixing herbs in dim rooms to ward off spirits, soldiers missing home but pretending not to care. It's their Egypt we're stepping into. So sit back, or walk with me if you're listening on the move. Let your imagination take over. Let your ears fill with the hiss of reeds and the quiet splash of oars on black water. Because this isn't just a story about Egypt. It's a story about us. You might think working the land in ancient Egypt was a back-breaking, joyless grind. And sure, there were moments where the sun felt merciless and the blisters came quick. But life on the floodplain wasn't just survival. It was routine, predictable. And in a strange way, it had its own comfort. It followed the moods of a river that behaved more like a clock than a wilderness. See, if you were a farmer, and to be clear, most Egyptians were in one way or another, your year didn't begin in January. It began with the Nile. Every summer, the river swelled, spilling across its banks in what the Egyptians called the Akhet, or inundation season. This wasn't a disaster. This was a blessing, a promise, written in water. The flood came like a ritual. At first, the river grew murky. Then it swelled quietly, creeping into fields like a guest who didn't bother knocking. For weeks, it stayed, covering the land in a thick layer of dark, silty mud. Then it would recede, like it had simply changed its mind. And just like that, the soil was ready. No plow, no fertilizer, no machines. The river did the heavy lifting. Without it, the earth was dry and stubborn. With it, it practically begged to grow things. The Egyptian farming year was broken into 3 neat chunks. Akhet, flooding, roughly mid-June to mid-October. Pere, emergence, growth, mid-October to mid-February. Shemu, harvest, mid-February to mid-June. It was elegant in its simplicity. You waited, you planted, you reaped, then you prayed the river would come again. During Akhet, farmers didn't farm. The fields were underwater. Instead, they were often conscripted into government labor, building temples, digging canals, hauling stone. This wasn't entirely optional, but it wasn't unpaid either. Workers were fed, sheltered, and in many cases treated with a certain level of dignity, unless you slacked off. Then, well, let's just say the overseers weren't known for patience. Once the waters pulled back, parade began. Farmers took to the fields with plows, usually pulled by oxen, sometimes just by hand, and sowed seeds, emmer wheat, barley, lentils, flax, and even papyrus in wetter plots. The entire community would take part: fathers, sons, wives, daughters, even toddlers who could just about carry a basket. By Shemu, the crops had grown tall. Sickles made of flint, set into wooden handles with resin, were used to cut them down. The harvest was fast and furious. There was no time to waste, because just over the horizon, the river would rise again. It always did. Forget tractors. This was farming with grit and sweat. Tools were simple, but clever. Shadufs, those pivoting buckets on long wooden arms, used to lift water from canals into irrigation ditches. A kid could use one. Most did. Plows, mostly made of wood, sometimes tipped with copper, pulled by cattle if you were lucky, by you if you weren't. Sickles, essential for harvesting, sharp, stone-edged, and surprisingly efficient. Hoop nets and baskets, for everything from collecting grain to trapping fish in side streams. And yes, there were sandals, but plenty of folks preferred bare feet. In the mud, they offered better grip, and besides, shoes wore out fast. A farmer's day started early, often before the sky even shifted from black to blue. There were no clocks, no alarms, just instincts, roosters, and the whisper of wind through the reeds. Mornings meant a small meal, maybe flatbread from the night before, dipped in oil or paired with dried figs. Beer, thick, yeasty, and more porridge than pint, was a staple. It wasn't the kind of drink to knock you flat. It was nutrition in a jug. Then the work began: weeding, watering, hauling, yelling, laughing, arguing. Same fields, different day. By midday, the sun was brutal. Not hot, brutal. You could feel your bones baking beneath your skin. Most took a break. Some napped in the shade. Others waded into canals to cool off. Then, when the worst had passed, the work resumed, until the light began to fade, and the horizon turned the color of old firewood. Farming wasn't solitary. You worked alongside neighbors, cousins, uncles, the guy who always stole your grain when he thought no one was looking. There were jokes and rivalries, songs to keep the rhythm, and long silences that didn't feel awkward. And beneath it all, pride. There was honor in growing things, in feeding a village, in taking what the river gave and turning it into life. Farmers knew they were the backbone of the kingdom, even if no one carved their names into granite to prove it. Wages weren't coins. They were measures of grain. That's how you paid your taxes, your debts, your workers, even your priests. You might store your harvest in clay jars, sealed with reeds, stacked in a cool corner of your home, or tucked inside a communal granary. A smart farmer always kept a little extra buried in the floor, just in case the tax collector forgot what he already took. And believe me, the tax collector never forgot. It wasn't all labor. There were feast days, festivals, weddings. If your harvest was good, you threw a party. If it wasn't, you prayed harder next year. Life was lived in full cycles, not just seasons, but stories passed from one wrinkled hand to the next. And the soil, it wasn't just dirt, it was sacred. The Egyptians believed their land had been created by the gods, that Osiris himself had once ruled as a mortal king, teaching them to farm before he became lord of the afterlife. Working the land wasn't just survival, it was legacy. Every now and then, archaeologists uncover tiny, overlooked details, seeds packed into burial jars, calloused hand bones in mummified remains, footprints hardened in ancient mud. These aren't just facts, they're echoes. They tell us someone stood there, thousands of years ago, hoe in hand, sweat on brow, doing the very same work we still do today. They remind us that life, real life, doesn't always show up in statues and scrolls. Sometimes it lives in the dust, waiting for someone to notice. We look at the Great Pyramid today and call it a wonder. And it is. There's no denying that. But calling it a wonder can be a bit misleading, don't you think? It makes it feel like it was conjured, like it just appeared. But that thing, it was built, block by block, by hand, by people, ordinary people, with names we'll never know, men with sunburns and chipped teeth and complaints about their supervisors. And they didn't just build for the sake of architecture, they built for the gods. Let's clear this up right away. The idea that the pyramids were built by slaves, it's not entirely true. Sure, Egypt had slaves, but the workers on royal projects like the pyramids or the grand temples of Karnak and Luxor, they were mostly free men, recruited from villages all over Egypt. Some volunteered, others were drafted, a kind of labor tax called corvée. You owed the state your time, usually a few months a year, and during that time, you'd work under the searing sun, hauling stones the size of buffalo up ramps and scaffolds, while priests chanted prayers to keep you from collapsing. Did they enjoy it? That depends. Some probably did. There was honor in it. Food, shelter, even medical care. You worked with friends. You got to be part of something grand. Others, well, others probably just gritted their teeth and counted the days. Imagine this, rows of mud-brick houses in the shadow of a half-built monument, smoke curling from ovens, laughter from somewhere near the granary, arguments over whose turn it is to clean the latrine. That's what a builder's village looked like, not some prison camp, a living, breathing place. The most famous one we've found is el-Medina, a workers' village near the Valley of the Kings. These guys weren't dragging stones. They were tomb builders, artists, carvers, craftsmen. They painted the stories of gods and pharaohs across tomb walls in blue and gold and deep red. And when they weren't working, they had wives, kids, gardens. Some even had side gigs, fixing sandals or carving trinkets for neighbors. Life there was structured, almost bureaucratic. They had foremen, scribes, sick leave. There were records of disputes, pay schedules, even complaints written on broken pottery like ancient HR tickets. One worker wrote, "I am ill. I shall not come." Another scribbled, "He drank beer and caused a fight." Some things never change. If you were part of a massive monument-building crew, say on the Giza Plateau, your days started early. The overseer's voice would bark orders before sunrise. You'd grab a chunk of flatbread, maybe wash it down with some sweet beer or garlic water, and head out with your crew. What did you do? Depends on your skill. There were stonecutters, chipping limestone in the quarries, haulers, dragging sledges across sand soaked with water to reduce friction, masons, smoothing blocks and fitting them just so, rope pullers, guiding stones up earthen ramps, tool makers, sharpening copper chisels every few hours, water carriers, running non-stop to keep everyone hydrated. The work was loud, gritty, dangerous. Ropes snapped, stones cracked, feet got crushed, and yet they kept building. You weren't paid in gold. That was for gods and kings. But you did get daily rations, lots of them actually. Bread, onions, fish, and up to 4 jugs of beer per day. Before you raise an eyebrow, know this. Egyptian beer wasn't for parties. It was thick, hearty, more like liquid porridge, packed with calories, perfect for laborers. Some workers even received extra portions, a kind of bonus system for good work or extra hours. Others got clothes, sandals, or even a little extra meat if the harvest had been kind. And yes, there was a sense of pride. You were part of something eternal. That limestone block you shoved into place, it might still be there 4,000 years later. That wall you carved with lotus flowers, tourists are still taking photos of it today. Not bad, huh? Temples weren't just places of worship. They were economic engines. Take Karnak Temple. It wasn't a quiet space with candles and hymns. It was a hive of activity. Priests, scribes, cooks, cleaners, guards, farmers working temple-owned land. And yes, builders constantly adding new halls, statues, and obelisks. Every new pharaoh wanted to outdo the last. Bigger halls, higher pillars, more inscriptions shouting their greatness from the sandstone. That meant more work for everyone, including you. Temples employed thousands, and if you were good with your hands, if you could carve granite without cracking it, or lay bricks so smooth that the gods themselves might walk on them, you could stay on permanently. Not just a seasonal builder, but a temple artisan. That was the dream. For all the pride and ceremony, the job could be brutal. You worked through injuries. You lost friends to accidents. You inhaled dust that stayed in your lungs forever. Sometimes you got punished for complaining. Other times, entire crews went on strike. Like one famous incident at el-Medina, when workers stopped building royal tombs because their rations were delayed. The first recorded labor strike in history, and it happened in ancient Egypt. Workers marched to a nearby temple, sat down, and refused to move. Their message? We are hungry. They weren't looking for wealth, just fairness. Eventually, the officials caved. The workers returned. The tombs continued. And history, once again, moved forward on the backs of the unseen. The irony? The men who built tombs so that others would be remembered rarely had their own names preserved. We find their graffiti on temple walls, little stick figures, crude jokes, messages like, "Peneb was here," scratched into stone. We find their bones buried in shallow graves without ornaments. We find their tools, worn smooth by years of calloused hands. And in all of it, there's something raw and human, something that makes the grandeur of Egypt feel grounded, because no monument stands without the hands that raised it. And those hands, they belong to men who sweated, ached, laughed, cursed, and, sometimes, just wanted to go home. They didn't build pyramids, and they didn't harvest barley by the basket load, but they were everywhere, these makers of things. And in a world that worshipped order, balance, and beauty, the work of a skilled artisan wasn't just appreciated, it was sacred. You want to understand Egypt? Look past the monuments. Look at the detail on a wooden comb, the painted face on a sarcophagus, the inlaid jewelry, the ink on papyrus, the glaze on a pot. None of it happened by accident. Often someone anonymous, made it, and made it beautifully. They weren't nobles, but they weren't peasants either. Craftsmen sat in this interesting middle layer, not quite elite, not quite common. They were specialists, people whose worth was tied to skill, not land. In cities like Memphis, Thebes, and later Amarna, entire districts were carved out for them, workshops nestled side by side with markets and merchant stalls. Think of it like an ancient industrial park, minus the chimneys. There'd be the leather workers, hammering out sandals and belts, the potters, spinning clay on stone wheels, hands caked with red dust, the weavers, bent over looms, turning flax into linen finer than silk. And always, the smell of glue, sweat, and fire. Some inherited their trades, others apprenticed under masters, and every one of them started at the bottom, sweeping floors, grinding pigments, fetching water. If you wanted to be a goldsmith, you first had to carry the charcoal. No shortcuts. Religion soaked into everything in Egypt, and craftsmanship was no exception. Even the most mundane object might end up in a tomb, offered to a god, or judged by its symbolism. Take a simple chair. You'd think it was just for sitting, right? Not in Egypt. It might have lion's paw legs, representing strength, carvings of lotus flowers, symbolizing rebirth, and it might be built with such symmetry that it could double as a shrine prop. Same goes for amulets. A tiny scarab beetle wasn't just jewelry. It was magic, protection, identity. And if you were the one carving it, you weren't just a craftsman, you were a conduit. Let's talk materials. Egypt wasn't exactly rich in natural variety, but they made do, and then some. Clay, ubiquitous and versatile, used for everything from beer jars to children's toys to funeral masks. Potters shaped it with foot-powered wheels and fired it in kilns, fueled by straw and donkey dung. Wood, rare and expensive. Native trees were few, so cedar and ebony were imported, often from Lebanon. Woodworkers guarded every scrap like gold. Stone, soft limestone for buildings, hard granite for statues, alabaster for decorative vessels. Stone carving was noisy, messy, and slow, but the results, unforgettable. Metals, copper was the workhorse, bronze a bit fancier, and gold, divine. Silversmiths were less common. Silver had to be imported and was even rarer than gold. Glass. Yes, they had glass. As early as the 18th dynasty, they were melting down colored sand and shaping it into beads, perfume bottles, and eye-catching tiles. What's amazing is how little went to waste. Scraps were melted down, shards reused, broken tools repurposed. Efficiency wasn't a trend, it was necessity. The better question is, what didn't they make? Linen robes so fine they shimmered in sunlight. Furniture with ivory inlays and carved legs shaped like geese or bulls. Makeup kits with compartments for green malachite and black coal. Toys, whistles, dolls with movable limbs. Boats stitched together from papyrus and resin. Cosmetic jars in the shape of gods or sacred animals. tools sharp enough to carve granite or tattoo skin. Even things we'd call mundane, buckets, sandals, ropes, were crafted with care. If something bore your name, even a comb, it mattered. Let's pause on one very specific craft: writing. To be a scribe was to hold power, silent, precise, almost holy power. Scribes didn't just write, they recorded, they calculated, they remembered. And in a culture obsessed with legacy, scribes were essential. You didn't become a scribe by accident. It took years of training. You had to learn hieroglyphs, hieratic, and later demotic scripts. You had to understand math, measure, law, and religion. And you had to be trusted. Because once something was inked, it was official. They worked with reed pens, dipped in carbon black or red ochre inks. Papyrus sheets were expensive, so every stroke mattered. A good scribe could land a job in a royal court, a temple, or even the tax office. Though let's be honest, nobody loved the tax office. And once you had that post, you didn't farm, you didn't build, you wrote, you lived longer, ate better, and avoided sunburn. Not a bad deal. Life in the workshop wasn't all sweat and silence. People laughed, they argued, they whispered secrets while polishing gold or measuring linen. Rivalries flared, apprentices slacked off, tools went missing. We even have notes scratched into pottery that read like casual complaints. He took my chisel and won't give it back. Or, he drank during shift again. There were jokes too, rude ones mostly, and drawings that ranged from clever to downright scandalous. One artist, perhaps bored or bold, doodled a pharaoh being chased by a goose. Even the most sacred craft needs a little humour. For all their work, most craftsmen weren't remembered. Their names, if they ever appeared, were scribbled in small script or hidden behind a statue. The glory belonged to the pharaoh, the priest, the god. But make no mistake, their fingerprints are everywhere. Every detail that still catches our breath today, it started in the hands of someone ordinary, someone quiet, someone brilliant. If Egypt had a spine, it wasn't made of stone, it was water. The Nile River wasn't just a backdrop to Egyptian life, it was the main character. Every sunrise cast a ribbon of gold across its surface. Every boat, every current, every lazy ripple carried not just goods, but stories. And if you made your living on the water, you didn't just work. You moved with the heartbeat of the kingdom. It's hard to overstate this. The Nile was transportation, communication, refrigeration, commerce, survival. Imagine a superhighway, a food truck route, a postal service, and a gossip line all rolled into one. But slower, smellier, and sometimes infested with crocodiles. And for those who lived on it, the fishermen, the sailors, the traders, it was everything. Let's start with the fishermen, those wiry, sun-darkened men who spent their lives chasing the slither and shimmer beneath the water. Some worked alone, others with crews. Nets were their lifeline. Cast nets, drag nets, scoop nets. If it could trap something scaly, they'd tried it. The Nile offered tilapia, catfish, perch, and smaller catches like eels or mudfish. Some folks even fished with harpoons, standing on little papyrus boats, legs braced, eyes sharp. Miss your shot, and the fish was gone. Hit it right, and dinner was secured. Fish were eaten fresh, but most were dried or salted. A strong-smelling fish market was a staple in every town, and its vendors. Let's just say they were not known for gentle negotiation. Haggling was an art form. Now, Was the river clean? Number. Not really. It was full of hippos, crocodiles, dung and runoff. But it flowed, and it gave life. And so people used it, trusted it, and sometimes feared it. Egyptians were boat people, period. Even before the pyramids, there were boats. By the Old Kingdom, they'd mastered the art of building them from acacia and cedar, held together with ropes and dowels, not nails. Some were simple papyrus skiffs, bendy and light, perfect for slipping into reeds. Others were huge wooden barges that could carry dozens of workers, livestock, or a whole cargo of grain. Sails arrived later, turning simple rowboats into wind-hungry vessels that could cover long distances. But don't be fooled. Even with sails, rowing was still part of the deal, and it was exhausting. Crews slept on board, under cloth shelters, eating cold bread and dried fish, while dodging mosquitoes the size of dragonflies. If you were a boatman, your arms were thick, your patience thin, and your knowledge of wind and current legendary. And then there were the boat captains, part seaman, part merchant, part taskmaster. If you got on their bad side, well, hope you could swim. Enter the traders. Now, trader might make you think of silk robes and counting gold, but a lot of them looked more like delivery guys, men who loaded up baskets of goods, grain, linen, pottery, perfume, papyrus, honey, and moved them from village to village, or city to city, or in the bravest cases, across the desert with donkey caravans. Local trade was constant. Everything Egypt produced was moved by boat, cart, or barefoot runner. Cities relied on the countryside. Temples needed offerings. Nobles wanted luxuries. And long-distance trade? That was where things got spicy. Egypt imported cedar wood from Lebanon, incense from Punt, possibly modern Eritrea, Somalia, copper and turquoise from the Sinai, silver and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and later glass, oils, wine, and even exotic animals. In return, they offered grain, papyrus, gold, linen, and of course, art. Some traders never saw a calm day. They dealt with broken wheels, flooded roads, missing cargo, customs officials, yes, even then, and every con man from Memphis to Aswan. But if you played your cards right, you came home rich, or at least with enough to throw a festival. Women weren't just bystanders. In local markets, they were active participants, especially in food, textiles, and perfumes. A woman might sell fish her husband caught, or trade linen she wove, or sell ointments, makeup, and amulets, hand-ground in her home and wrapped in cloth. And don't underestimate their influence. A clever woman in a market stall could negotiate harder than a pharaoh's vizier. Even the river had rituals. Before major shipments left port, traders often made offerings. Fish guts to Hapi, the god of the Nile, beer to Osiris, a whispered prayer for calm water, for safe arrival, for fair prices. Because to lose a shipment wasn't just financial, it could be spiritual failure. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was a mood. Now and then, trade expeditions went out into the open sea. That was a big deal. The Egyptians weren't natural ocean navigators. The Red Sea and Mediterranean made them nervous, but they tried. And sometimes they succeeded. Tales tell of journeys to Punt, to the Levant, to the islands beyond sight. Some brought back gold, ivory, monkeys, incense. Others never returned at all, but in every case it was brave, a kind of ancient entrepreneurship, the kind that meant leaving everything familiar behind and trusting wind, wood, and willpower. The busiest towns, like Elephantine, Thebes, or Per-Rameses, had noisy, chaotic docks. Porters shouted, donkeys brayed, officials inspected cargoes with wax tablets in hand, and rumors traveled faster than boats. A new pharaoh in the north? Everyone knew by nightfall. War with Nubia? The dock merchants were already raising prices. Life on the river wasn't just about goods. It was about information, rhythm, and movement. It was, in every sense, the bloodstream of Egypt. After the boats were tied, after the fish were smoked, after the market stalls closed and the stars shimmered above the reeds, there was peace. Men lay on their backs, arms behind their heads, listening to the soft splash of water licking the banks. They had stories to tell, bruises to press, dreams to chase. Tomorrow would come with more noise, but tonight belonged to the river. Let's strip away the grandeur for a minute. No pyramids, no priests, no royal guards patrolling the palace steps. Just home. Because for most Egyptians, farmers, craftsmen, traders, even lower-level scribes, the village was the world. Small, sun-baked, usually within walking distance of a canal or a field, and packed with the kind of sounds that never quite stop. Kids laughing, dogs barking, the sharp clang of pestles against grain. It wasn't glamorous, but it was familiar, lived in, worn smooth by generations. And in that ordinary, something kind of magical happened. If you were to walk through a typical ancient Egyptian village, you'd notice one thing immediately. Everything's made of mud brick, not clay, not stone, not wood. Too expensive, remember? Just Nile mud, straw, and sunshine. Bricks were handmade, dried on rooftops, and stacked into walls with the same casual permanence as you'd stack laundry baskets. And, you know what? They held up for decades, sometimes centuries, until a good rain or a crumbling corner meant it was time to patch things up. Houses were simple, 1 or 2 stories, flat-roofed, a main living space, maybe a few side rooms, a small courtyard, often with goats, chickens, or drying herbs. The roof doubled as storage, sleeping quarters in hot months, and general catch-all. Windows, tiny slits if any, mostly for ventilation, not views. Inside, you'd find reed mats, low stools, clay pots, maybe a shrine tucked into a niche, a little figure of Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, or a worn statuette of a household god like Bess, who looked like a cross between a lion and a goblin, but kept nightmares away. And on the walls, nothing fancy, whitewashed if you had time, smoky from the fire if you didn't. There was no town hall, no mayor's office, but everyone knew who was in charge. Usually the village headman, a respected elder with a memory like an ostrich and a glare that could stop children mid-mischief. News came from traveling merchants, tax collectors, temple runners. Messages weren't written. They were shouted, repeated, passed from mouth to mouth, until even the animals knew what was going on. And at the center of it all, the well and the grinding stone. These were where people gathered, women with jars on their heads, children chasing each other with palm fronds, a place to gossip, grumble, and, occasionally, argue over who left their fish guts in the water bucket. Community happened here, not in speeches, but in shared routines. Cooking happened outside more often than in. Fires and enclosed spaces, not a great combo. So most homes had simple clay ovens or used communal baking spaces shared between families. You'd see rows of dough set out in the morning sun, fermenting under cloth, loaves tucked into glowing embers by mid-morning. By noon, the air was thick with the scent of bread, onions, and maybe roasting pigeon if someone had been lucky with a sling. And it wasn't just smells, it was sounds, the rhythmic thump of women pounding barley, the slosh of water carried in jugs, the distant cluck of hens, and the too close bray of a donkey with attitude. Doors were almost never locked. Most didn't even have a latch. Neighbors drifted in and out, borrowing salt, asking favors, offering a taste of lentil stew. Privacy, a luxury no one expected. But belonging, that was built into the walls. Kids were everywhere, because life was fast and short, and large families were a safety net. Little ones ran barefoot through alleyways, covered in dust, bellies full of dates or bread crusts. By the age of 5 or 6, they were working, helping with harvests, weaving, chasing chickens, hauling water. Play still existed, of course, with balls made of leather, rag dolls, toy boats, and the classic pastime of bothering your siblings. They learned by doing. There were no schools, unless you were training to be a scribe. But if your father was a brickmaker, guess what you became? If your mother was a weaver, you were twisting threads before you knew the word loom. Let's be clear. Women ran the household. Period. They managed food, children, finances, worship, and neighbors. They also brewed beer, wove linen, spun thread, managed gardens, and occasionally ran small businesses, like selling oils or trinkets at the local market. Some even owned property, sued in court, and wrote wills. Egyptian women had more legal rights than many women in later societies. Their lives weren't easy, but they were far from passive. And their presence was felt in every woven basket, every calloused hand, every clean child or warm loaf pulled from the oven. They were the quiet core of the village. Let's walk through it, just for a moment. You wake before sunrise. The air is cool, just barely. Roosters already shouting. You stretch, yawn, pull a tunic over your shoulders, and step outside. Your neighbor's son is already chasing goats with a stick. Your wife is at the grindstone, humming something old. Your youngest is still asleep, curled up on a mat. You grab a flat cake of barley bread, swipe it through some goat cheese, and eat it while fixing a broken bucket. The day will be long. There's a taxman rumored to be nearby, and the granary's getting low. But there's also a wedding next door tonight. That means music, and beer, and laughter spilling into the stars. And for a moment, just one brief, dusty, sunlit moment, you're glad to be exactly where you are. If the Nile was Egypt's lifeblood, then food was its daily prayer. Not the kind spoken aloud in temples, but the quiet, grounding ritual of tearing warm bread with your fingers, of dipping onions into salt, of sipping thick, sour beer as the sky slowly dims and the family gathers. In Egypt, food wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. It was reliable, rhythmic, built on what the land gave and the river allowed. And for the common person, a farmer, a fisherman's wife, a potter's son, food meant survival, but also comfort, even pride. It meant home. Let's start with the staples, the stuff you'd find in almost every meal, every home, every era of ancient Egyptian life. Bread, not the fluffy, crusty kind we imagine today. This was dense, heavy, dark with husks, sometimes gritty with bits of sand from the grinding stone, made from emmer wheat or barley, kneaded by hand, often baked in dome-shaped clay ovens that could fit a dozen small loaves at once. Beer. Again, not Heineken. Egyptian beer was more like fermented porridge, cloudy, thick, and nutritious. It was made from partially baked bread mixed with water and left to ferment. It was a meal and a drink in one, and it was everywhere. From temple offerings to children's cups. Onions, raw, boiled, pickled, roasted, cheap, pungent, filling. Egyptians considered them. Bread, beer, and onions might have been the anchors, but there was plenty more to fill the belly, depending, of course, on the season, your job, and your luck. Legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans were stewed, mashed, or roasted. These were earthy, filling, and came straight from the Nile's generous banks. Vegetables, cucumbers, leeks, garlic, radishes, and lettuce. The kind of food that tasted better the closer you were to the soil. Not flashy, but honest. Fruit, figs, dates, pomegranates, grapes. Sweetness was rare, so a ripe fig was something to savor, slowly, while bees hovered greedily nearby. Meat, rare for the poor. Pigeon, duck, or goose if you were lucky, maybe during a festival. Beef? That was for temples and the elite. More common folk relied on dried fish, frogs, or the occasional lizard. Fish, more regular, especially for riverside villages. Catfish, tilapia, eels, grilled or dried in the sun with a thick layer of salt. The smell stuck to your hands for days. Dairy. Goats and cows gave milk, which turned quickly into yogurt or a soft cheese. Butter was a luxury, rarely seen, but a hunk of sour cheese with warm bread, that was a meal that could keep you going all day. Oils and fats, used for cooking and cosmetics alike. Castor oil, linseed oil, and animal fat were burned in lamps, rubbed on skin, or poured into pans. Spices? Not many. Salt, coriander, fenugreek, and maybe a handful of imported luxuries like cinnamon if you lived near a trade hub. But for the most part, flavor came from freshness or fermentation. You wouldn't recognize a kitchen if you stepped into one in 1500 BCE. For starters, it was usually outside, a small courtyard behind the house, shaded by a woven mat or grapevine trellis. Fires were dug into clay or stone pits. Ovens were round, domed affairs, with flames licking the edges of the bread as it baked against the inner walls. Most cooking was done by women, or if the family was wealthier, by female servants. Pots were unglazed clay, blackened by years of smoke. Spoons were carved from wood. Pans were scarce, and food was often roasted on sticks, grilled over coals, or baked in hot ash. And because there was no refrigeration, everything had to move fast. Milk spoiled by midday. Meat lasted hours, not days. Bread grew mold if the weather turned sticky. So food was made daily, in small batches, by people who measured time not in hours, but in light and scent, and the feel of dough between their palms. Meals were often shared from a single bowl. No plates, no forks, just fingers, clean or not, depending on the day. Families squatted or sat cross-legged on mats, under the shade if they were lucky. Children reached first. Elders chewed slowly. Bread was used to scoop, dip, or soak. No one wasted a crumb. Hospitality mattered. If someone stopped by during a meal, you made room, even if it meant giving them the last piece of dried fish. Refusing to share was more shameful than being poor. During festivals, weddings, or big harvests, the diet improved dramatically. Roasted meats, honey-sweetened cakes, wine instead of beer, even dried fruits soaked in date syrup. Some wealthier families might have hired cooks to prepare extravagant feasts with stuffed ducks, fruit stews, and wine served in decorated ceramic cups. And sometimes there were food fights. No, not the messy kind, the symbolic kind. Banquet paintings often showed guests tossing bits of food at musicians or dancers in jest. It was rowdy, loud, joyful. A full belly was a full heart. In good years, granaries were stuffed and bellies full. But when the Nile failed to flood, everything fell apart. Crops withered, bread prices soared, hungry mouths turned desperate. Famine wasn't just a possibility, it was a memory passed from parent to child. That's why the granary keeper was one of the most important figures in any village. They tracked harvests, guarded stores, and determined how much food to ration if things got tight. A corrupt keeper could starve a town. A wise one could stretch a poor harvest just long enough. And if famine got bad enough, well, people left. Whole villages uprooted, hoping to find better soil, or temple kitchens willing to share. Still, for all the hardship, most Egyptians ate, daily, consistently. There was a rhythm to their meals, a kind of sacred normalcy, and in that, a deep contentment. They didn't feast every day, but they ate together. They laughed. They argued over who took the last onion. They made jokes about sour beer and flat bread and fish that tasted like river mud. And after the meal, someone, always someone, would sigh, lean back, and say something like, "May the Nile be kind next year." Because food in Egypt wasn't just nourishment. It was a promise. Picture an Egyptian. Odds are, you're imagining someone in white linen, sandals, maybe a gold collar gleaming in the sun. And you're not wrong, but that's just the tip of the needle. Clothing in ancient Egypt wasn't just functional. It was symbolic, social, sometimes seductive, and almost always intentional. Whether you were bending over a field, carving stone in a tomb, or praying in a temple, what you wore mattered. It showed your role, your rank, your reverence, and sometimes, just sometimes, your rebellion. Let's start with the basics. The climate was hot, the work was physical, the materials were limited. So, Egypt turned to what it had in abundance: flax. From this came linen, light, breathable, and durable, the ideal fabric for a sun-baked civilization. Making linen was no quick task. Harvest the flax, soak and dry the stalks, beat the fibers, comb and spin the threads, weave the fabric on looms that often took up half a room. The result, a spectrum of cloth grades, from coarse workers' wrap to sheer royal gauze that barely hid the body underneath. Everyone wore linen. It was law, almost religion. Wool was considered unclean, used sparingly, and never allowed in temples. Cotton, not yet. Silk, foreign and rare. So when in doubt, linen. Always linen. The average man wore a kilt, called a shendit, wrapped around the waist and tied with a sash or belt. In the Old Kingdom, it was short and boxy. By the New Kingdom, it had grown longer, pleated, even ornately draped. Labourers might go shirtless, especially in the fields. Scribes and priests wore longer tunics. Soldiers wore short kilts for mobility. And elite men? Think layers. Layers of fine linen, sometimes starched so stiffly they rustled as they moved. Footwear, sandals, made from papyrus or leather, but many went barefoot. Sandals were for hot stone floors or formal visits. For most, toes in the dust was just life. Women's fashion evolved, quietly but confidently. In early periods, the standard was a tight sheath dress, ankle length, with straps over the shoulders, often plain, sometimes patterned with beads or colored stitching. Over time, wraparound dresses, shawls, and pleated robes became more common, looser, layered, elegant in their simplicity. Wealthier women wore linen so fine it was nearly transparent, not scandalous, but stylish. Embellishments came in the form of jewelry, sashes, or colored hems. And maternity wear? There wasn't a special wardrobe, just looser wrappings, more cloth. Practicality ruled. Small children often went naked. Totally. Until the age of 6 or 7, most kids wore little more than an amulet or a bit of string around the waist. It wasn't neglect. It was normal. The sun was warm, the work was dusty, and washing linen was labor-intensive. Clothes came later, when a child was expected to help, learn, and carry status. Until then, let them run. Hair was serious business. Men often shaved their heads. A clean scalp was cooler, cleaner, and considered more respectable in certain jobs, especially priesthood. But not always. Farmers let it grow. Nobles wore it cropped or curled. And children? Often shaved with a single lock left on the side of the head, the famous side lock of youth. It marked innocence, hope, and the grace of the gods. Wigs, though, were the real showstoppers. Wigs were made from human hair, sometimes mixed with plant fibers. They were braided, oiled, and styled to perfection, worn on special occasions or daily by elites. There were short bob styles, elaborate curls, fringe cuts, and even double-layered wigs with built-in perfume cones. Yes, cones of scented fat that melted in the heat and made you smell like lotus. Imagine that, scented fat melting into your scalp at a banquet. Glamorous, in theory. Makeup wasn't just vanity. It was protection, identity, power. Both men and women wore kohl, made from soot or galena, to darken their eyelids, not just for beauty, but to reduce glare and ward off infection. Think of it like a cross between eyeliner and sunblock. Eyes were emphasized heavily. The more dramatic the line, the more powerful you appeared. Think Cleopatra? That wasn't a phase. That was tradition. Other popular cosmetics included green eye paint from malachite, red ochre for cheeks and lips, henna for nails and hair, perfume oils rubbed on skin, stored in alabaster jars. Cosmetics were kept in carved palettes and decorative jars, often shaped like animals or gods. Applying makeup was almost ritualistic, an act of self-respect and divine imitation. Every Egyptian, rich or poor, wore some kind of jewelry. Amulets for luck, love, fertility, health. Necklaces and collars, wide, beaded, colorful, symbols of beauty and power. Bracelets, anklets, rings, earrings, made from gold, silver, copper, glass, or faience. Faience, that gorgeous blue-glazed ceramic, was everywhere. It sparkled like turquoise, but cost far less. Even the poorest villagers wore it proudly. Jewelry wasn't just pretty, it was meaningful. A scarab ring could ward off evil. A heart amulet ensured justice in the afterlife. A lotus pendant promised rebirth. And when someone died, They were buried with jewelry, always, because even in death, you needed protection and style. In the end, Egyptian clothing and adornment reflected more than beauty. It reflected your job, your gender, your social class, your religious role, your mood, your hope. It told others what to expect. It reminded you who you were. And when you stood before the gods, it helped you look your best. Because in Egypt, how you presented yourself mattered, not just to the living, but to eternity itself. When we picture ancient Egypt, we often think of stone, hard, unchanging, eternal. But the real foundation of Egyptian life wasn't limestone or granite. It was the family, not just mother, father, child, but a larger, warmer structure. Cousins, uncles, neighbors, in-laws, even the gods invited into the mix. Egypt was a place where households blended work, worship, and kinship, and where roles were understood, but not always rigid. So if you really want to understand what made this civilization last for over 3,000 years, don't just look at the pharaoh's throne. Look at a couple arguing about whose turn it is to fetch water. The typical Egyptian household was small, but lively. One-room homes often held multiple generations. Parents, grandparents, children, possibly a widowed aunt, and maybe a neighbor's child staying temporarily. Space was shared. Privacy was rare. But there was an understanding. You helped each other, or you didn't last. Sleeping arrangements were flexible. Reed mats on the floor, cushions if you were lucky. Babies stayed close to their mothers. Elders claimed the least drafty corners. The roof was fair game in hot months. Everyone worked. Everyone contributed. Even the old woman with a bad back still told stories that kept the children still long enough for their parents to finish kneading the dough. Forget white dresses and wedding feasts. For most Egyptians, marriage wasn't about ceremony. It was about cohabitation and commitment. There were no formal religious rites or vows, at least not for the average couple. If a man and woman decided to live together and raise a family, that was marriage. Sometimes they signed a marriage contract, especially if property or dowries were involved. But mostly, it was based on mutual consent and social recognition. And here's the surprising part. Egyptian women had remarkable legal rights for the ancient world. They could own property. They could inherit land. They could divorce. They could sue in court. They could even retain custody of children in many cases. In theory, and sometimes in practice, marriages were partnerships, not always equal, but often collaborative. The wife ran the home. The husband worked outside. Both roles were vital. And yes, there was love. Letters and poems from the period show tenderness, affection, even flirtation. One scribe wrote to his wife, "I wish I were the clothes that touch your body." Who says the ancients weren't romantic? Children were joy and burden all at once. You had many, because child mortality was high, and because hands were always needed. By the age of 5 or 6, children were fetching water, tending goats, pounding grain, minding siblings. Girls often worked beside their mothers. Boys followed their fathers or joined workshops as apprentices. Education was rare, unless the family could afford to send a son to train as a scribe, a profession that opened doors far beyond the plough. But childhood wasn't all toil. There were toys, balls, spinning tops, dolls with movable limbs. There was play, Games in the dust, races down the alley, hide and seek in the reeds. And always there was laughter, loud, wild, unapologetic, the kind that echoed off mud-brick walls long after the sun had set. Let's not pretend this was some ancient utopia of equality. Patriarchy still reigned. Men held official power. They signed contracts, owned land, performed public rituals. But women had more autonomy and authority than in many later cultures. They managed households, ran small businesses, and, in rare cases, ruled as pharaohs. A woman's social standing often depended on her husband or father, but her legal standing, that was her own. She could testify in court, she could inherit from her mother, she could write her own will, and inside the home, her power was undeniable. Marriage, too, was not a lifelong sentence. Divorce existed, and it wasn't scandalous. Either party could initiate it. Reasons varied: infidelity, infertility, incompatibility, and when it ended, property was divided, children were assigned, and life went on. The heart was no stranger to Egyptians. Love poetry from the New Kingdom is tender, even sensual. Your voice is sweet, I live to hear it. Your lips are honey, I kiss them. I would give up everything to lie beside you, just once more. But where there's love, there's jealousy. Some tomb graffiti tells of rivalries, accusations, even curses scrawled in anger. One man accused another of stealing a woman's heart with lies. Another wrote, "May your house fall into shadow, thief of joy." Emotions weren't hidden. They were carved, sung, shouted, much like today. Every stage of life had meaning and ritual, even for the poor. Birth, assisted by midwives, guarded by amulets of Taweret and Bez, gods of fertility and protection. Naming often reflected values. Merit Amun, beloved of Amun. Pasherempta, the son of Ptah. Adulthood, marked by work, marriage, and contribution to the household. Old age, respected, if not always easy. Elders were advisors, storytellers, keepers of memory. And when death came, the family mourned loudly, publicly, wailing, chanting, hair-pulling, not because they lacked composure, but because grief was sacred, a final gift. For the Egyptians, the home was a sacred space, a little universe of order, Maat, in a chaotic world, Isfet, every loaf of bread baked, every jar of water filled, every story told to a sleepy child. These weren't just chores, they were acts of devotion, not just to the gods, but to one another. Because the real strength of Egypt, the part that held through drought, war, and empire, wasn't just in its pyramids or palaces, it was in its families. Everyone talks about the pyramids and the priests, the golden statues, and the endless hymns echoing through Karnak and Luxor. But here's the truth. Most Egyptians never stepped inside a grand temple, never saw a god statue unveiled, never offered incense in a ritual led by a shaved-headed priest chanting in hieroglyphs. Yet every single one of them, from the fisherman gutting perch on the Nile to the girl weaving linen in a Theban courtyard, believed. Not because they were forced, because it was as natural as breathing. Religion wasn't a separate part of their lives. It was their lives. It was there when the child cried out in fever, when the crops bent under wind, when the boat drifted too far from shore. It was everywhere, in the stones, in the river, in the dust beneath their sandals. Egypt had hundreds of gods, some local, some national, some massive cosmic forces, others more like neighborhood guardians. You didn't need to understand the entire pantheon. No one did. You just needed to know your gods. Hapi, the god of the Nile. Without his blessings, no harvest, no bread, no life. Bes, the squat lion-dwarf god who guarded homes, scared away nightmares, and helped with childbirth. Taweret, the fierce hippopotamus goddess, watching over mothers and babies. Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of the dead, invoked when burying a loved one. Ra, shining above, reborn each dawn, setting each dusk, constant as breath. Isis and Osiris, the divine couple, symbols of love, death, and eternal return. Each village had its own preferences. Some favored falcon gods, others swore by cow goddesses. It wasn't about theology. It was about trust, familiarity, whispers made real. Even the smallest house had space for the divine, a niche in a wall, a small statue on a shelf, a painted symbol on a pot. Offerings were simple: bread, beer, onions, a lock of hair, a whisper of thanks. Sometimes, a traveler passing a sacred tree would tie a strip of cloth around it, a silent plea for safe passage. A fisherman might toss a bit of his catch back into the water for Hapi. A child might bury a bead in the yard and ask for a puppy. Faith didn't need formality, just presence. Grand temples weren't off limits, but they weren't exactly open door either. Ordinary Egyptians could approach the outer courtyards, leave offerings, pray aloud. But the inner sanctuaries? Only priests, only rituals, only gods and those who served them directly. Still, festivals, oh, the festivals, changed everything. Egyptians loved a good procession. Festivals weren't solemn affairs. They were noisy, joyful, crowded. They spilled into streets with music, beer, dancing, painted faces, and enough food to keep even the grouchiest scribes smiling. During these festivals, sacred statues were carried out of the temples on barks, sacred boats, covered in gold, veiled in cloth. People threw flowers, cried out blessings, reached toward the god as if to touch the sun. Some festivals lasted days, with music, with rest, with prayer, with pure collective hope. The gods were no longer locked inside sanctuaries. They walked among the people, and in that moment, everyone felt seen. Religion wasn't just for comfort. It was a kind of agreement, a spiritual social contract. If you lived well, acted justly, respected the gods, and kept your heart clean, you would pass into the field of reeds, Egypt's serene afterlife. If you didn't, well, things got tricky. The weighing of the heart ceremony wasn't metaphorical. Egyptians believed your heart was weighed against a feather, the symbol of Ma'at, goddess of truth and balance. If your heart was heavy with guilt or evil, Amit, a demon part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus, devoured it. And that was it. No afterlife, no do-over. So people tried. They helped neighbors, honored family, kept their promises, not out of fear, but out of a desire to belong to something bigger, something eternal. Not everything came from temples. Much of Egyptian religion was practical magic. Amulets carved from faience or stone were worn to protect from scorpion stings, nightmares, infertility, gossip, even taxes. Spells were whispered before sleep, or written on linen and buried under thresholds. Healers used herbs and incantations. Priests of Sekhmet, goddess of disease and healing, performed rituals to drive out illness. Mothers whispered names of gods into their babies' ears. Fathers touched amulets to their sons before sending them to work. Magic wasn't superstition. It was a language, a way to negotiate with the unseen. Everything had meaning. Nothing was random. A cat wasn't just a pet. It was a reflection of Bastet, guardian of the home. A lotus was more than a flower. It represented rebirth, the sun rising from darkness. A scarab beetle meant transformation, the sacred dung beetle who rolled the sun across the sky. Even colors mattered: red for power, blue for protection, green for growth, black for fertility. Yes, black, like the fertile Nile soil. This was a world where the sacred and the ordinary overlapped constantly. Egyptians weren't naive. They questioned, they doubted, they debated the behavior of gods. They told stories where gods got drunk, made mistakes, or abandoned the world. But they believed anyway. Not because life was perfect, but because faith made sense of its imperfections. They watched the Nile flood, the sun rise, the stars return, the child grow, the old pass, and they believed, quietly, steadily, for over 3,000 years. To live in ancient Egypt was to live surrounded by powers, not just the official gods with temples and priests, but things older, stranger, more personal, invisible forces, whispered names, objects worn against the skin, hidden under beds, buried in doorways, or stitched into children's clothes. Magic wasn't a separate discipline or a last resort. It was woven into everything. Illness? It had a cause, maybe physical, maybe spiritual. Bad luck? You'd offended someone or something. A baby's fever, a demon's breath, a string of bad dreams. Someone might have cursed you, so you fought back, not with swords, but with spells, oils, charms, and faith. Because in Egypt, to be alive was to be a little bit magical. The Egyptians had a word for this force: Heka. Heka wasn't just magic in the Harry Potter sense. It was a primordial power, a force that predated the gods. Even the gods used Heka to speak, to create, to heal. Every ritual, every prayer, every whispered charm was a form of Heka in action. And here's the twist. Everyone had access to it. Sure, priests and scribes had fancier tools, scrolls, incantations, secret knowledge passed from master to apprentice. But your average midwife, your neighbor who sold herbs, the old man muttering at the wall while tying knots into palm fronds, they were all practitioners of magic. You didn't need permission, just belief. If there was one object that united all Egyptians, rich or poor, old or young, it was the amulet. Amulets were protective, symbolic, and often beautiful. They were worn as necklaces, sewn into clothing, hidden in sandals, placed under pillows, or even inserted into the folds of mummies. Each one meant something. Each one did something. Popular amulets included the Eye of Horus, Wedjat, for protection, healing, and clarity. You could find it etched into boats, painted on doorways, or hung around a child's neck. Scarab beetle, for rebirth, transformation, and protection in the afterlife. These were often carved from faience or green stone. Jed pillar, symbol of stability, linked to the god Osiris, worn by the elderly and placed in tombs. Ankh, the symbol of life, often given as a gift, passed from parent to child. Sesen, lotus, represented rebirth and the sun, sometimes worn during childbirth or placed in homes to invite peace. Amulets weren't fashion statements, they were armor. Some were spoken aloud, some were written on linen and tied to limbs. Others were drawn in sand, whispered 3 times, and blown into the wind. Magic dealt with the mundane. Let this child sleep without fear. Let this beer not spoil. Let my cow return from the field unharmed. And the dangerous, may the scorpion's poison leave the blood. May the demon pass over this threshold. May she who cursed me lose her voice. Curses existed too. Oh, they existed. But more often than not, magic was defensive, protective, a way of shielding what you loved from forces you couldn't see. Healers were part physician, part priest, part magician. They knew their herbs, willow bark for pain, garlic for digestion, castor oil for constipation, frankincense for swelling. But they also knew the spells that made those herbs work. A poultice was always applied with intention. A cut wasn't just treated with salve, it was spoken over. One common healing spell translated loosely as, "Pain, fly away. I bind you with reeds. I cast you into the river. The crocodile eats you. You are no more." For childbirth, a terrifying sacred process, midwives used amulets of taweret and bez, burned incense, tied red threads to the wrists of laboring mothers, and drew protective symbols on the walls. Magic kept the mother breathing, the child crying, the rooms sacred. Dreams weren't dismissed. They were messages. Dream interpreters were respected members of society. They kept dream books, literal manuals that translated common visions. A snake in the bed, treachery. A lion on the roof, strength. Losing teeth, death, or renewal. But context mattered. Who dreamed it? When? During what phase of the moon? After what meal? Some people slept with amulets under their pillows to guard their dreams. Others burned herbs before bed to drive away spirits. And if a dream was too strange, too sharp, you told the priest, or the wise woman down the alley, or both. You didn't need wealth to work magic. You needed intention. A mother might draw a protective circle around her child's bed with powdered ochre. A farmer might spit 3 times toward a black cat crossing the path, just in case. A fisherman might whisper the name of a river spirit before casting his net. Egyptians negotiated with the universe constantly, not because they were afraid of it, but because they respected it. They knew that life was fragile, that things went wrong, that loss could come swiftly. So they prepared, with magic, with belief, with hope. Words were sacred. Hieroglyphs weren't just letters, they were living symbols. To write something was to give it power. To read it was to release that power. That's why so many spells were inscribed on pottery, papyrus, beads, blades, walls, coffins. Some tombs have spells painted near the entrance to ward off thieves. Others have instructions to resurrect the dead, guide them through the afterlife, protect them from monsters. And in homes, potsherds, ostraca, often held short incantations to protect against fever, to silence the jealous tongue, to find what was lost. They were tucked into walls, hung from rafters, forgotten, and remembered again centuries later when archaeologists held them in shaking hands. Every ancient Egyptian carried fears of sickness, betrayal, infertility, starvation, the wrath of gods, the whisper of a ghost outside the window. But they didn't cower. They painted protective figures above their doors. They wore carved stones close to their hearts. They sang songs that banished evil. They turned belief into action. Magic wasn't a last resort. It was a way of taking control when the world didn't make sense. It still doesn't. Death, to the ancient Egyptian, wasn't an ending. It was a transition, a crossing, a process. And just like any important journey, it required preparation, not just for kings or priests, but for everyone, even the potter in the village, even the midwife, even the man who carved boats but never once sailed far. They believed in life after death, and not in a vague, ghostly way. They imagined a real place, with fields, rivers, loved ones, gods, sunshine, and in that place, the field of reeds, the soul could live forever, free of pain, free of hunger, surrounded by the beauty of all it had lost, but only if you got there. When someone died, the home changed immediately. Mirrors were covered, fires were smothered, furniture was turned upside down, all to confuse the spirit, or possibly to warn it that it had passed from one state to another. Family members wept loudly, tore at their clothes, scattered dust in their hair. It wasn't performative. It was essential. Grief had to be public. It had to be heard. The louder the mourning, the more honored the dead. And then arrangements began. Even in modest households, preparations were made quickly. A proper burial was vital. Delay could disturb the soul, leaving it restless and unfulfilled, a risk no family could afford. We think of mummies as royal, and they often were, but simpler versions were practiced at every level of society. The wealthiest might afford full embalming, removal of organs, natron drying, linen wrapping, even a painted death mask. The middle class settled for partial treatment, body drying, light wrapping, maybe a few protective amulets tied near the heart or throat. The poorest buried their dead quickly, often in shallow graves outside the village, wrapped in mats or linen scraps, sometimes with just a handful of grave goods, a pot of beer, a loaf of bread, maybe a worn comb or favorite amulet. The goal? To preserve the body, just enough so the soul would recognize it in the next life. Because to enter eternity, you had to be whole, in body, in name, in memory. Tombs, even the simple ones, were considered eternal houses. Some were rock-cut chambers, others were mud-brick rectangles, still others were little more than a pit covered with limestone slabs, but all were made with intention, because the tomb wasn't for the dead. It was for the ka. The ka was a person's life force, and it needed a place to rest, to receive offerings, to linger near the living. Families returned to tombs often, bringing bread, beer, flowers, incense, and spoken prayers. Some tombs had false doors, carved into walls, so the ka could move freely between worlds. Offerings left near these doors weren't symbolic. They were dinner. Even the poorest Egyptian was buried with something. A few loaves of bread, a jar of beer, a favorite necklace, a scarab amulet, a comb, a letter from a loved one, scratched into a potsherd, a model of a servant figurine, to work on your behalf in the afterlife. The wealthy went further. Full wardrobes, makeup, instruments, board games, even miniature furniture and boats. One woman, clearly practical, was buried with cooking pots and a spare pair of sandals. Another with a mirror and coal pot. Vanity, number identity. These objects weren't for comfort. They were continuity, proof that life would go on. Everyone, regardless of class, believed they would one day face Osiris, lord of the underworld. In the hall of two truths, your heart, not your deeds, not your words, would be weighed against the feather of Mayat, the goddess of justice. A light heart? You passed. You entered the field of reeds, a place of peace, abundance, family, and joy. A heavy heart. You were devoured by Amit, the soul eater. No second chances. To help the deceased, many were buried with copies of the Book of the Dead, a guidebook of spells, directions, and moral affirmations. Not everyone could afford it, but many had small excerpts written on walls, linen, or papyrus. And if they couldn't write it, they memorized it, or hoped their loved ones would speak the words on their behalf. Heaven, in Egyptian belief, wasn't clouds and harps. It was a perfected Egypt. Cool breezes, endless fields to farm, not as labor, but joy. Full granaries, clear rivers, teeming with fish. The company of family, friends, and the gods themselves. In the field of reeds, the sun always shone. Bread never went stale. Beer never soured. Cats lived forever. It wasn't paradise because it was unfamiliar. It was paradise because it was familiar, made perfect. The truest death in Egypt wasn't when the body stopped. It was when the name was no longer spoken. That's why names were inscribed on everything. Pots, combs, door frames, children's bracelets. That's why families returned to tombs for generations. That's why the Book of the Dead often ended with a plea. May my name be spoken. May my memory remain. May I live again. To be remembered was to live. To be forgotten was to vanish. So every amulet, every offering, every whispered prayer in the wind, they weren't for the dead alone. They were for the living too, to remind them you matter, and maybe, just maybe, that's why, 3,000 years later, we still remember their names. You've heard the phrase, all work and no play. The ancient Egyptians, they didn't believe in that. Sure, they toiled in fields, cut stone, raised children, and fought wars, but they also partied, not in the modern sense, with disco balls and fireworks, but with a kind of holy revelry that blurred the line between sacred and joyful. Festivals weren't just rest days. They were rituals in motion, celebrations that reminded people they were more than laborers, more than subjects. They were part of something divine. And when the gods stepped out of their temples and into the streets, everyone followed. By the New Kingdom, there were dozens of official feast days, and even more local ones. Some months had multiple festivals. Some gods had multiple birthdays. Some towns made up their own, and nobody complained. The temples, which owned land and employed thousands, had entire calendars of rituals and processions, and while the innermost ceremonies were reserved for priests, the public always got their moment. If you lived near a major temple, say at Karnak or in Memphis, festival days were unforgettable. If you lived in a tiny village, you still celebrated, with bread, beer, singing, and impromptu dances in the dusty square. Some of the most beloved holidays: Wepet Renpet, New Year's Day, the beautiful festival of the valley, a kind of sacred family reunion; Opet Festival, honoring Amun's divine rejuvenation; Feast of Hathor, music, love, and inebriation, sanctioned by the goddess of joy; Festival of Koyak, honoring Osiris and the cycles of death and rebirth. And beyond that, every season change, harvest, local god's birthday, or royal jubilee brought a reason to gather. They were loud, unapologetically so. Drums pounded, flutes trilled, priests chanted, women ululated, children laughed, dancers painted their faces with ochre and streaked their arms with green. And in the center of it all, the god's statue, hidden from view most of the year, was carried out, swaying atop a golden bark, veiled in linen, surrounded by incense. People wept, people clapped, some bowed, some just stared. That statue wasn't just wood or stone. On that day, it was the god, and it was among them. Every festival had a rhythm: preparation. Homes were cleaned, food was stockpiled, bread ovens ran non-stop. Offerings, loaves, beer jugs, flowers, garlands, perfumes, brought by the basketful to temple gates. Processions, priests carried sacred boats through the streets or floated them down the Nile. People followed, sang hymns, threw petals, or whispered wishes. Feasting, sacred offerings were often redistributed. Even the poor could eat well: meat, dates, wine. Rest and rejoicing, no work, just family, friends, storytelling, games, and music long into the night. Some festivals turned raucous, especially those honoring Hathor, the goddess of music and intoxication. Dancing got wild, beer flowed freely, and no one pretended to be somber. Egyptian New Year didn't fall on January 1st. It aligned with the heliacal rising of Sirius, just before the annual Nile flood. This was the start of everything, the year's first breath, a time of purification, rebirth, and renewal. Priests bathed statues, temples burned incense by the mound. People hoped, quietly but fiercely. It wasn't about resolutions, it was about balance, a chance to realign with Ma'at, the divine order. And always, people watched the sky. This one deserves its own moment. Held annually in Thebes, this festival saw the statue of Amun cross the Nile from Karnak to visit the Valley of the Dead. The gods visited the ancestors. The people followed. Tombs were opened. Graves were cleaned. Families gathered beside their dead with food, music, and candles. Imagine it, a quiet picnic among the tombs, voices low, hearts full, not mourning, but celebrating. Death wasn't absence, it was part of the rhythm. The living didn't forget the dead, and the dead, they believed, didn't forget them either. Their best. Freshly washed linen, sometimes perfumed with oils, jewelry, even borrowed, layered proudly, wigs adorned with flower garlands or little perfume cones, coal-lined eyes, even for the men, painted feet and hands, henna-colored. Even the poorest tried. Even a single flower behind the ear was enough to show respect. To celebrate a god was to remind yourself of the divine pattern: life, death, renewal. Festivals weren't a break from religion. They were religion, moving, dancing, joyful religion. They gave people hope. They gave them relief. They reminded a tired builder, a grieving mother, a hungry farmer, that joy was sacred too, and that the gods, for all their distance, still walked among them sometimes. Eventually, the drums faded, the fires died down, the statue was returned, the priests closed the gates, and the people, they went home, tired, joyful, changed, even just a little, because something had been stirred, something ancient and alive, something they'd carry with them as they returned to their ploughs, their looms, their ledgers, until the next festival, the next chance to dance with the gods. Ancient Egypt was a land of monumental silence, towering columns, massive tombs, stone-faced sphinxes. But listen closely, and you'll find that it was also a land of voices. Not everyone could write. In fact, most couldn't. Hieroglyphs were complex. Writing tools were expensive. Schools were for the elite. And yet, everyone lived inside a world of story, of spoken memory, of sound. Egypt was alive with words, not always inked, but spoken, shared, remembered. Because while the stone may have crumbled and the papyrus burned, the stories, they kept walking. Let's start with the writers. To be a scribe in ancient Egypt was to hold real power, not political power perhaps, but something even more lasting, control of memory. Scribes wrote letters between officials, inventories of grain, beer, livestock, contracts, marriage agreements, legal complaints, hymns and temple records, speeches for kings, spells for the dead. And because words were sacred, every mark of the reed brush was an act of devotion. Learning to write took years. First, the child memorized the alphabet, a complicated blend of hieroglyphic, hieratic, and eventually demotic scripts. Then came grammar, copying exercises, storytelling. Mistakes were punished. Excellence was praised. A good scribe could rise in society. A great one, immortalized. But here's the thing. Writing wasn't the only way to record. For every word written, thousands were spoken. Egyptians shared knowledge through oral tradition, stories, parables, jokes, songs, proverbs. And this wasn't just idle chatter. It was education, memory, cultural glue. In villages, at market stalls, by cooking fires, people told tales of gods and monsters, stories of pharaohs disguised as beggars, fables about animals and justice, ghost stories meant to keep children from wandering too far, songs to help the grain grow, lullabies that called on Hathor to bless the sleep of children. And the speakers? Not always priests or elders. Sometimes the best storyteller in town was a farmer's wife, or the girl who gathered herbs and told legends to every curious child who followed her. Oral tradition was vibrant, flexible, always evolving. A story told in Nubia might be different from one in the Delta, and that was fine. Stories weren't fixed. They were alive. Let's walk through a few. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor. A man survives a shipwreck and washes up on a mysterious island ruled by a talking serpent. The serpent tells him of his own lonely past and sends him home with riches. A story about survival, humility, and the wisdom of beasts. The doomed prince. A cursed royal child flees fate and finds love, But his destiny catches up in unexpected ways. One of Egypt's rare romantic tragedies. The eloquent peasant. A poor farmer, wronged by a nobleman, delivers 7 poetic speeches demanding justice. It's a lesson in persistence, law, and the power of words. The story of Sinuhe. A court official flees into exile, lives among foreign tribes, and longs for home. A story of identity, loyalty, and belonging. Possibly autobiographical. These weren't bedtime fluff. They were morality tales, social critiques, dreams wrapped in myth. They asked hard questions. Is justice real? Can fate be outrun? Is truth always rewarded? And they didn't always offer easy answers. Every society has its idioms. Egypt was no different. Common proverbs were scratched into walls, recited in marketplaces, muttered under breath. A handful of grain is better than a sack of promises. Do not be proud of what you know. A child may teach you. The mouth of a fool is a trap for the wise. Better a friend in the field than gold in the vault. There were thousands of them. Funny, sharp, biting, comforting, passed from tongue to tongue like heirlooms. Even kings quoted them. Some of the earliest books in the world weren't stories. They were guides for living. Egypt's wisdom literature included instructions written by viziers, scribes, and officials to their sons or students. Things like, control your tongue, do not be swift to speak, for words are arrows. Do not fill your belly at the king's table, lest he think you greedy. Respect the poor, for fortune is a wheel. Think of it like a mix between a father's advice, a motivational speaker, and a manual for survival. People didn't just read them, they recited them, carried them in memory, whispered them to children. You didn't need a scroll to be famous, just a voice. Some people made a living, or at least earned a meal, by telling stories, traveling from town to town, appearing at festivals, or hired for private gatherings. They knew how to weave suspense, how to change voices, how to pause, just long enough to make the audience lean in. They were the Netflix of their time, and just like now, some were terrible, some were brilliant, and the best, they were remembered. Egypt was a place of order, ma'at, but life wasn't always predictable. Floods failed, children got sick, kings died suddenly, so people told stories, to make sense of things, to preserve the past, to teach, warn, laugh, and belong. Even the gods were storytellers. Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of wisdom and writing, was believed to have penned the secret histories of the world. So to speak a story aloud, that was divine imitation, a kind of prayer. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your ruler was more than just a man. He was divine. The pharaoh wasn't just king. He was the living Horus, the son of Ra, the walking, talking axis between heaven and earth. But here's the twist. For most Egyptians, the pharaoh wasn't some distant, untouchable icon. He was a presence, silent but powerful, felt in taxes, labor, religion, even family meals. You might never see him. You might not even know what he looked like. But you felt him. Every jar you filled, every brick you laid, every word you spoke with your heart clenched. The pharaoh was somewhere behind it. He wore crowns, yes, but he also wore responsibility. The pharaoh's job wasn't just to rule. It was to maintain Ma'at, the sacred balance between order and chaos. That meant feeding the people, defending the borders, building temples, honoring the gods, judging the wicked, keeping the Nile's rhythm in divine harmony. A tough gig, really. He was surrounded by advisors, priests, generals, and an elite bureaucracy. Think of him as a spiritual CEO, signing off on everything from pyramid budgets to flood control. But his power wasn't unchecked. A pharaoh who failed to uphold Mahat could be remembered poorly. Some were literally scrubbed from history, names erased from walls, statues shattered, records deleted. Oblivion was a political punishment. While the pharaoh reigned, the vizier ruled. He was the top official, the voice of law, the master of paperwork, the coordinator of everything. The vizier supervised tax collection, law courts, building projects, land surveys, grain storage, and temple administration. Basically, if something moved in Egypt, a cart, a cow, a canal, the vizier knew about it. He had scribes, lots of them. Each scribe had scribes, and those scribes probably complained about back pain and ink shortages. Egypt didn't have a single written law code like Hammurabi's Babylon. Instead, justice was based on precedent, custom, and the guiding principle of Ma'at. Disputes were settled in local courts, sometimes in temple courtyards, other times under the eye of a noble or priest. Judges heard complaints about stolen donkeys, unpaid debts, marital disagreements, and land boundaries. Court records from the New Kingdom show real people arguing over real problems. My neighbor moved the boundary stone at night. She took my husband's cloak and won't give it back. I lent him a goat. Now the goat is dead. Testimony was spoken aloud. Oaths were sworn in the names of gods. False testimony was punished, sometimes with flogging, sometimes with exile. There were jails. But for most common crimes, punishment was immediate. Fines, beatings, forced labor. Justice was swift, not subtle, and occasionally poetic. One man was sentenced to pay a debt with onions, to be delivered weekly, a public reminder of both the crime and the flavor of humility. No one liked the tax collector, ever. Taxes were paid in goods, not coins. Egypt didn't run on silver, it ran on grain. Every farmer owed a portion of his harvest to the state. Land surveys ensured accurate counts. Scribes checked records. Overseers traveled village to village with ledgers, guards, and attitude. If you fell short, first they asked why. Then they inspected your barn. Then they measured your family's field. If they still weren't convinced, they took what they could, often extra. Sometimes farmers hid grain, buried it, lied about crop yields. But the state had ways. Neighbors talked, children slipped up, dogs dug in the wrong spot. And yes, there were revolts, occasionally, but more often there was grudging compliance, because taxes didn't just go to the palace. They funded grain reserves, canal maintenance, temple offerings, and emergency food distribution. In theory, anyway. Besides grain, Egyptians owed labor to the state, called corvée. You might be summoned to dig irrigation canals, rebuild temple walls, transport stone, serve in a militia, help with government warehouses. It wasn't slavery. You were fed, housed, and returned home. But it wasn't optional either. The pharaoh gave, but he also took. And everyone, even scribes, knew that. Pharaohs didn't just rule by decree. They ruled by image. Their names were etched onto every temple wall, their achievements exaggerated, their statues exaggerated more. They were depicted smiting enemies, offering incense, standing between heaven and chaos. Did most farmers believe all of it? Maybe, maybe not. But the effect was real. The pharaoh was always watching, and that idea, comforting or chilling, shaped how people behaved. Some worshipped him, some merely obeyed, but no one ignored him. Egypt's government was astonishingly organized. There were scrolls for everything: birth records, land deeds, work assignments, food distribution, legal appeals, temple donations, grain tallies down to the last sack. Scribes kept Egypt running, not warriors, and this created stability. A worker in Asyut and a merchant in Memphis understood the same rules, feared the same penalties, and dealt with the same script. The system had flaws: corruption, delay, intimidation, but it was strong, too strong sometimes to escape. Despite everything, the taxes, the labor, the rules, most Egyptians weren't crushed under royal weight. They lived within the system, navigated it, bent the rules when they could, appealed to local officials, appealed to the gods, appealed to luck. They respected the pharaoh, sometimes with love, sometimes with sarcasm. One graffiti from el-Medina reads, "The king commands, but the grain decides." In other words, even divine power bows to hunger. In the murals and monuments of Egypt, everyone seems to have a place, a clear place. The pharaoh stands tall, perfect, eternal. Priests chant beneath columns. Soldiers stand in lines. Farmers bend beneath sheaves of wheat. Slaves carry jugs. It all looks so organized, but real life, not quite so simple. Yes, ancient Egypt was hierarchical, and yes, social class mattered. But like most human systems, there were exceptions, loopholes, and the occasional wild success story. There was order, there was aspiration, and sometimes, just sometimes, there was movement. Pharaoh sat alone at the summit, both king and god, both ruler and symbol. Below him came the elite royal family members, princes, princesses, queen mothers, viziers and high officials, generals and governors, high priests and temple administrators. These were the ones who lived in villas with gardens, dined on roasted goose and sweet wine, and held elaborate funerals with musicians and mourners. Their names were carved into stone. Their stories were remembered, mostly as examples of loyalty and piety. But even among them, status was never permanent. Fall out of favor, fail to produce results, or back the wrong political horse. You could be exiled, erased, or worse, forgotten. Next came the professional tier, the real machinery of Egypt. Scribes were the true middle class. They weren't wealthy, but they were powerful. Literate in a world where most were not, they controlled communication, accounting, administration, and justice. A good scribe could live comfortably, a great one could climb. Craftsmen, especially in royal workshops, were respected for their skill. A master goldsmith, sculptor, or builder might be given housing, regular rations, and a name remembered for generations, even if written small. Foremen, overseers, warehouse keepers, and estate managers lived on the threshold between power and labor. They answered to nobles, but commanded workers. Their lives were measured in scrolls, not sweat, though the line between the two was often blurred. Here lay the bulk of the population, and arguably the backbone of the empire. Farmers made up the majority. Their lives were hard, their homes humble. They worked in the fields from before sunrise to long past midday, planting, harvesting, and paying their dues in grain. Most lived in small, tightly packed mud-brick houses with extended families and shared courtyards. Fishermen, potters, herders, weavers, and bakers kept towns running and granaries stocked. Their work was physical and often seasonal. A bad flood could ruin a year. Yet many of them had skills, pride, and community. They didn't aim to climb the social ladder. They aimed to survive it. And in that, they succeeded more than they're often given credit for. Slavery in Egypt wasn't like later forms of chattel slavery. It was more diverse, more layered. Many slaves were war captives. Others were debt servants. Some were even born into servitude. They worked in noble households, temple complexes, farms and fields, quarry and construction crews. Some were treated well, others were not. A lucky or talented servant might earn freedom. A trusted one might even rise, as in the case of some foreign-born administrators who began as captives and ended up as palace stewards. There were also people who lived without titles, itinerants, beggars, wandering laborers, those who didn't fit cleanly into the system, but existed nonetheless. They were rarely written about, but they were everywhere. Here's where things get interesting. Egypt wasn't a meritocracy, but it wasn't entirely closed either. A farmer's son could become a scribe if a wealthy patron took interest, or if his father scrimped and saved for education. A talented craftsman could rise through temple workshops to become an art director. A particularly clever servant might be trusted with more responsibility, even rewarded with land or freedom. And for those born with ambition and luck, there were real stories of people rising from humble origins to positions of power. One famous example, Horemheb, a military general who became pharaoh. Not royal-born, just excellent at navigating power. Another, Ka, a chief architect buried with honors, once reserved for nobility. Social climbing was rare, but not impossible. You needed talent, patronage, and perhaps most of all, a lifetime of patience. Status mattered, but so did reputation. A generous farmer might be better loved than a greedy noble, a just overseer more respected than a cruel priest. Funerary inscriptions often praised the deceased not for wealth, but for kindness, honesty, and fair dealing. And in the afterlife, everyone faced the same test, the weighing of the heart. Rich or poor, the feather of Ma'at didn't care how high your sandals reached. Class showed in, clothing, finer linen, more jewelry, better sandals. Language, scribes and officials used formal, polished speech. Farmers used idioms and earthy humor. Homes, number of rooms, quality of brick, presence of a courtyard or granary. Funerals, the more elaborate the burial, the higher the status. But even the simplest graves held pride. Still, Egypt had a way of making status visible without gloating. Modesty was admired. Bragging was frowned upon. A well-respected village elder might own little, but be honored deeply. Egypt's class system wasn't flat, but it wasn't a prison either. It was a network of relationships, responsibilities, and reputation. You were born into a place, but how you lived in it mattered just as much. And in the end, rich or poor, scribe or servant, farmer or pharaoh, All returned to the earth. All hoped for peace in the field of reeds. Not every Egyptian spent his life tilling the fields or baking bread under the watchful eyes of overseers. Some were called, or sometimes compelled, to serve in a different way, as soldiers, defenders of the borders, enforcers of the Pharaoh's will, agents of state, sword, and sand. And though Egypt was famously stable, with long stretches of peace, that didn't mean life as a soldier was easy or safe, because the frontiers, they were far, and quiet threats always simmered at the edge of empire. Some joined for duty, others for food, and some because, quite simply, they had no choice. Military service wasn't always voluntary. Like labor taxes and temple work, it was part of a citizen's expected service to the state, especially during the New Kingdom, when Egypt expanded far into Nubia, Canaan, and Syria. The army swelled with both career soldiers and conscripted peasants. But for those who stayed on, there were perks, steady rations, meat, bread, beer, sometimes better than at home, clothing and weapons, linen uniforms, leather sandals, copper or bronze swords and daggers. Pay, not much, but more than a farmer might see in a season. Land grants. Retired soldiers were sometimes awarded land, enough to start over, even prosper. The army, for some, was a path to mobility. For others, it was the only path out of poverty. Training camps weren't glamorous. Recruits learned marching in formation, using bows, javelins, spears, and short swords, chariot handling for the elite few, basic first aid, mostly by experience, obedience. The instructors were brutal. One inscription reads, "The instructor hits harder than a hippopotamus. His tongue is sharper than a flint knife." Still, the training was practical. Soldiers weren't expected to fight like Spartans. They were expected to survive, follow orders, and hold the line. Most soldiers weren't out on endless campaigns. They were stationed in forts, border towns, and way stations, especially in Nubia, the Sinai, or near the Libyan frontier. A garrison town was a mix of barracks, granaries, armories, training fields, temples. Even soldiers needed divine backup. Families, yes, many soldiers brought wives and children. Life there was slow, repetitive, and often tense. Patrols were regular, drills constant, but most of the time, it was just hot, boring, and dusty. Letters from garrison soldiers talk about missing home, dealing with unfair commanders, and the boredom of watching empty roads day after day. But they also mention drinking songs, wrestling matches, storytelling contests, a pet monkey that stole bread, because even warriors needed a bit of levity. Every so often, things shifted. The Pharaoh declared war, the scribes issued orders, and suddenly 1,000 men found themselves on the march toward Nubia, Canaan, the Libyan desert, or even into Hittite lands. Campaigns were massive undertakings. Soldiers marched in formation, flanked by supply carriers, scribes, priests, and charioteers. The elite warriors, clad in bronze and carrying curved swords, rode in two-man chariots, thundering across dry plains. Combat was terrifying. Arrows flew, spears clashed, chariots charged. Victory meant loot, promotion, maybe even a statue in the temple back home. But for the regular foot soldier, it meant heat stroke, fear, and watching friends fall. Victory was sweet, but it came at a price. Not all soldiers were single. Many were married. Some brought their families to military towns. Others left wives and children behind for months, sometimes years. Letters from these men, scratched onto papyrus or pottery shards, reveal longing, worry, and frustration. Has the grain arrived? How is the cow? Tell my boy I miss him. Why have you not written? Is it because you are angry? I dreamt of you. You were near the temple. The child ran to me. Families struggled. A woman might be both parent and farmer in her husband's absence. Children grew up with stories of bravery and absences that lingered. Egypt wasn't ethnically homogeneous, and neither was its army. Foreigners, Nubians, Libyans, Asiatics served in auxiliary units. Some were prisoners of war turned loyal fighters. Others were hired as mercenaries, especially in turbulent times. They brought new weapons, new tactics, and often new tensions. But many stayed, settled, married into local communities, became Egyptian in all but name. The army, in this way, was both an engine of defense and a machine of assimilation. A soldier who survived long enough and served loyally could retire with honor. Some received land, others appointments in administration. A few became scribes, tax officials, or temple guards. Graves of decorated soldiers show scenes of bravery, peace, and family. Their titles: servant of the king, one who protected the border, loyal son of the Black Land. And they were remembered, not just for fighting, but for returning, because that, in Egypt, was the real victory. Soldiers weren't kings, but they weren't outcasts either. They were respected, sometimes admired, occasionally feared, and always, always needed. They stood between chaos and order, between foreign kings and village farmers, between the ambitions of the court and the quiet lives of those back home. And for every monument carved with tales of conquest, there were 100 untold stories of men who fought, endured, returned, and simply became fathers again. When we picture ancient Egypt, we often think of stone, statues, pyramids, temples, eternal things. But life, it began in mudbrick homes, wrapped in linen, cradled in whispers. For all its gods, armies, and monuments, Egypt was also full of birth cries, sticky toddler fingers, lullabies hummed over oil lamps. And though childhood in Egypt could be short and fragile, it was no less vibrant, no less loved. Pregnancy was both miracle and danger. There were no ultrasounds, no sterile wards, only tradition, home remedies, and hope. When labor came, midwives took over. No men, no priests, just experienced women who knew the signs, who could read a woman's face, the rhythm of her breath, the color of her fingertips. They used birthing bricks, small clay platforms the mother could squat upon, amulets, especially of Taweret, the hippo goddess who protected mothers, and Bez, the dwarf god who frightened away evil. Incantations and prayers, oils and herbs to soothe pain, encourage contractions, or stop bleeding. Some texts describe chants spoken during labor, lines like, "Slide out, little one, like a fish in water. Come to your mother's arms, come into the light." It wasn't medical, it was magical, emotional, spiritual. because life was a gift, and no one assumed they'd receive it easily. A baby's name wasn't just a label. It was a wish, a protection, sometimes a prayer. Names were often connected to gods, family roles, or circumstances of birth. Merit Amun, beloved of Amun. Ptah Hotep, Ptah is satisfied. Nebet, lady, suggesting grace or status. Ahmosa, born of the moon. Some names were simple, even humorous. Others were ambitious, like Yuzakaf, meaning his car is strong. A child might also have nicknames based on physical traits, personality, or birth order. These names were used affectionately at home and sometimes passed down like family heirlooms. To name a child was to give them a path, a place, a voice, and every parent hoped the name would carry them far. Infant mortality was high, no sugarcoating that, so mothers took every precaution, hung protective charms over the cradle, rubbed sacred oils onto the baby's skin, breastfed immediately, often exclusively for the first year, whispered prayers with every sneeze, cough, or cry. Some babies were swaddled, others left free to kick in linen slings. Parents often co-slept, keeping the baby warm and close. Cribs weren't common, baskets were, and despite the risks, joy was everywhere. Little footprints in the dust, first teeth celebrated, neighbors stopping by to pinch cheeks and offer charms, fathers lifting their sons high and laughing, even after long days in the sun, because love, even in ancient Egypt, was universal. Children weren't dressed in fine linen or jewelry, not at first. Most ran around naked or half-clothed until age 6 or 7, especially in hot months. They played with clay animals, reed dolls, mini-boats, knucklebones like dice, homemade balls, and slings. They also imitated adults. A boy might pretend to plow a tiny field. A girl might bake mud loaves by the oven. Children were everywhere, underfoot in workshops, watching mothers grind grain, playing tag through temple courtyards. But play didn't last forever. By age 8 or 9, chores began. Boys helped in fields or workshops. Girls helped grind flour, fetch water, weave, or care for younger siblings. Work was part of life, but so were stories, games, and song. Childhood wasn't stolen. It was woven into the rhythm of the family. Not everyone went to school. Most didn't. But learning happened anyway. Girls learned from mothers how to cook, clean, weave, sing lullabies, make beer, manage a household. Boys followed fathers into farming, pottery, fishing, or carpentry. But in wealthier families, or if a child showed talent, a boy might be sent to a temple school or scribe's apprenticeship. There, the days were long and strict, memorizing symbols, copying texts on broken pottery shards, practicing etiquette, grammar, religious hymns, getting smacked for errors. Discipline was firm. The best students became scribes, officials, or temple readers. For a farmer's son, this was a dream, and not impossible. A few rose, most didn't, but the path existed, and even the ones who stayed in the fields carried stories and songs they'd never forget. There wasn't a clear coming-of-age ceremony, no bar mitzvah, no birthday cake. Instead, adulthood arrived slowly. A girl began wearing dresses, then jewelry. A boy began wearing a side lock of youth, then shaved it. A youth might be called to temple service, or apprenticed to a master. A girl might be promised in marriage at 12 or 13. No fanfare, just a gradual shift. One day, your chores got heavier, your voice deeper, your freedom slimmer. And yet, most families found joy in it. Pride in a son's first harvest. A quiet celebration when a daughter wove her first dress. Because time moved differently in Egypt. Slowly, but surely, like the Nile. In tomb inscriptions, we find what parents prayed for their children. May he grow strong and upright. May she be kind and gracious. May the gods favor his breath. May she walk the path of Ma'at. And when children died young, as they too often did, the grief was sharp. Tomb scenes show small children holding hands with parents, names etched lovingly beside adult ones, dolls and tiny sandals left as offerings. A child lost was a wound felt forever. A child raised well, a blessing. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't the end. It was a transition, not a door slammed shut, but a passageway, a winding corridor with rituals, risks, and hopes waiting on the other side. To the Egyptians, life was fleeting. The Nile might flood, crops might fail, fever might come without warning. But if one lived rightly, if one followed Ma'at, then death could be conquered, not erased, but transformed. They believed in an afterlife that wasn't cloudy or vague. It was tangible, familiar, a perfected version of the world they knew, full of green fields, warm sun, endless grain, and peace. But to get there, you had to be prepared. When someone died, there was no confusion about what came next. The grief was immediate. Family members wept, tore their clothing, and covered their heads in dust. Mourning wasn't quiet. It was loud, raw, visible. Wailing women, often hired mourners, cried out the name of the dead. Neighbors brought offerings. Friends gathered in courtyards. Children lit lamps. But alongside the grief came action, because time was short and the soul was already on the move. Only those who could afford mummification received it, but even simple burials followed deep ritual. For the wealthy or official, the body was taken to the embalmer's workshop, often near the Nile. The brain was removed through the nose using a hooked tool. Organs were taken out and placed in canopic jars, each guarded by a protective god. The body was dried with natron salts for weeks. After drying, it was wrapped in linen, layer after layer, often with amulets tucked between folds, eyes, scarabs, ankhs. The face might be covered with a death mask. Priests recited prayers and performed the opening of the mouth ritual to allow the dead to breathe, eat, and speak in the afterlife. This wasn't just medical, it was spiritual craftsmanship. For the poor, the body might be wrapped in a reed mat, buried in a simple grave with a jar of beer and a loaf of bread, still sacred, still honored, because every soul, rich or poor, had a chance at eternity. Once prepared, the body was placed in a coffin, or several, nested like sacred dolls. The funeral procession included family and friends walking behind the bier, priests with incense and ritual tools, mourners crying and singing, servants carrying food offerings, statues, and treasured possessions. Sometimes boats carried the dead across the Nile, from the land of the living, east, to the land of the dead, west. And as they walked or rowed, They recited the names of the dead, because to speak a name aloud was to keep the soul alive. The tomb wasn't a grave, it was a house for eternity. Even the humblest grave included something, a clay shabti figure to serve the deceased in the afterlife, a scarab amulet to protect the heart, a jar of beer, a bit of bread, a favorite tool, doll, or comb. The wealthier tombs had painted walls showing scenes of ploughing, hunting, feasting, music, and family. Not memories, not dreams, instructions. This was how the afterlife would be shaped. As one inscription put it, "I will thresh grain in the field of reeds. I will drink beneath the fig tree. My wife will bring me water, and my children will sing." A map of hope, painted in ochre and love. After burial came the great cosmic trial. The Book of the Dead, a guidebook for the afterlife, tells us how the soul would stand before Osiris, god of the underworld. The heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If it was light, unburdened by lies, cruelty, or injustice, the soul passed. If heavy, it was eaten by Amit, a beast part lion, part hippo, part crocodile. No afterlife, just silence. But those who passed, they were granted access to the field of reeds, a paradise of abundance, beauty, and peace. No hunger, no sorrow, just continuation, not floating in clouds, living as they once did, but without pain. Egyptian paradise wasn't abstract. It looked like the Nile, calm and gleaming, endless fields of grain, trees heavy with figs, dates, and pomegranates, clear water channels, cool breezes, boats to sail, songs to sing. You could farm if you wanted, fish, dance, be with loved ones. The work was joyful, effortless, and shabti figures did the chores when needed. You were whole again, old wounds gone, youth restored. You visited temples, honored gods, spoke with ancestors, saw your grandchildren's grandchildren grow in dreams. It was, in every way, a better Egypt. Even after death, the dead remained part of the family. Offerings were made on feast days, names spoken at meals, letters written and left at tombs. "Father, I miss your counsel. My wife is kind, the boy strong. Please send luck." The dead weren't forgotten. They were consulted. Tombs were visited, swept, maintained, because to forget a name was to kill a soul, and to remember was to keep the story going. You want to know what life was really like for everyday Egyptians? Forget the temples for a moment. Don't look at the statues. Instead, follow the scent of fresh bread, roasted fish, and simmering lentils. Because in ancient Egypt, as in every corner of human history, food was everything. Survival, celebration, offering, and daily rhythm. And the kitchen, smoky and sunlit, was where much of life happened. Let's not sugarcoat it. The ancient Egyptian diet was heavy on carbs, but they made those carbs count. Bread was the backbone, dense round loaves made from emmer wheat or barley, grains ground by hand on stone querns, often with bits of grit that wore down teeth over time. The process? Women ground the grain. The flour was mixed with water, salt, and sometimes herbs or dates. Dough was shaped into discs or cones. Loaves were baked in clay ovens, dome-shaped and stoked with wood or dried dung. They also made beer, not the golden bubbly kind we know today, but thick, yeasty, sour brews, closer to liquid bread. It was made by crumbling baked loaves into water, letting it ferment, and sometimes sweetening it with dates or figs. Every household drank it: adults, children, priests, farmers. It was food, hydration, and comfort, all in one. The Nile's gift was more than silt. It was abundance. Along the floodplain, farmers grew lentils, fava beans, onions, a favorite, seen as a symbol of eternity, garlic, leeks, radishes, cucumbers, lettuce, celery. These weren't side dishes, they were the meal. Stews of beans and onions, spiced with herbs, served with bread, fed workers, priests, and palace officials alike. Olive oil was rare early on, but linseed, flax oil, and animal fat were used in cooking. And yes, they had salt, harvested from the desert or traded in from Mediterranean routes, essential not just for taste, but for preservation. When Egyptians wanted a treat, they reached for dates, figures, grapes, pomegranates, dom palm fruit, a fibrous fruit eaten dried or fresh, sycamore figs, distinct from modern ones, a little less sweet. Fruits were eaten fresh, dried for winter, or mixed into pastries. Yes, they had simple desserts, often made with flour, honey, and fruit pressed into cakes. Sugar didn't exist, but honey was highly prized, used sparingly, often reserved for temples or special offerings. Most Egyptians didn't eat meat daily. It was expensive, time-consuming, and sacred animals, like cattle, were often off-limits, outside of festivals or priestly circles. When they did eat meat, it was usually duck, goose, pigeon, quail, occasionally goat or mutton. Fish, however, was abundant and common, caught from the Nile, salted or dried for storage. Catfish, tilapia, and perch were favorites. Fishermen used nets, spears, even woven traps. We know some people, including children, got tired of it. One ancient letter says, "My son says he won't eat another fish this month." We feel you, kid. Most homes had a clay hearth, often in a corner or outdoor courtyard. Pots were set over fire or coals, and pans, usually made of ceramic or bronze, were used for frying and baking. Cooking techniques included boiling stews in earthenware jars, roasting meat on spits, grilling fish on flat stones, sun-drying fruit and fish, fermenting dough, beer, or vegetables. And who did the cooking? Women, usually, mothers, daughters, or servants. Recipes weren't written down, but passed mouth to ear, hand to hand, over generations. Though not the spice paradise of later centuries, Egypt wasn't bland. They used coriander, cumin, fenugreek, mustard seed, dill, anise, thyme, sometimes cinnamon and frankincense, imported for the wealthy. These were used in cooking, medicine, and even mummification. Flavors were earthy, fragrant, and often layered, with pungent onions, sharp herbs, and the deep funk of fermented dough. On special days, religious festivals, harvest celebrations, births, weddings, funerals, food flowed more freely. The rich slaughtered animals, temples distributed offerings, musicians played while jugs of beer passed from hand to hand. There were pastries, stewed dates, grilled meats, and fig cakes sweetened with honey. and even the poor could feast on such days, sharing in the divine through food. One festival, in honor of Hathor, the goddess of joy, was literally called the Festival of Drunkenness. It involved staying up all night drinking beer, listening to music, and hoping for visions of the goddess. Who said ancient Egypt was all discipline and duty? There were no forks, but they used wooden spoons, clay bowls, and of course, their hands. Meals were often taken on low stools, with communal dishes set on mats. The main cook, usually the mother or oldest woman, served everyone, with the head of the household eating first. Children learned table manners early. Eat what's served, don't waste, praise the cook. Dinner wasn't fast. It was family time, with stories, laughter, and planning for the next day. And through it all, food was sacred. Every meal began with a silent nod to the gods. Offerings were placed before statues, even in the poorest homes. Bread, beer, onions, and salt might be set aside before the family ate, because the gods fed you, and they must be fed in return. Temples received vast quantities of food daily, distributed to priests, workers, and sometimes the needy. Nothing wasted, nothing taken lightly. To feed someone in Egypt was to honor them, and to eat well was to live well, not just in body, but in spirit. It's easy to picture ancient Egypt as a land of toil, fields, stone blocks, chisel marks on temple walls. And sure, life was demanding, but that wasn't the whole picture. Even in a world where life was short and floods were unpredictable, Egyptians made time for relaxation, storytelling, music, and games. Joy wasn't a luxury. It was part of the rhythm of life, just like the Nile. So, what did people do when they weren't grinding grain, serving the gods, or hauling baskets of mudbrick? Plenty. Let's start with games, because Egyptians loved them. They played alone, in pairs, or surrounded by curious onlookers. The most famous game? Senet, played on a 30-square board. Two players took turns moving pieces based on throw sticks or dice. More than just a pastime, it was thought to reflect the journey to the afterlife. Kings were buried with Senet boards. Scribes wrote about it. Even commoners scratched makeshift grids into stone or mud floors. Other games included Mehen, the game of the serpent, with a spiral board, hounds and jackals, a race-style peg game with holes shaped like animal heads, knucklebones, early dice made from animal joints, pebble tossers, ball games, tug of war. Children played rough, adults played clever, and everyone gambled, at least a little. If you walked through a market, passed a village square, or sat near a temple courtyard, you'd likely hear music. Instruments were everywhere, lyres and harps, some large enough to stand beside. Flutes, made of reed or wood, breathy and melodic. Drums, for rhythm, dance, and processions. Sistrums, sacred rattles used by priestesses. Tambourines, lutes, clappers. Music wasn't background noise. It was emotion made audible. At home, someone might hum while kneading bread. In taverns, wandering musicians played for coins or beer. During festivals, whole ensembles marched through the streets. And in temples, music was divine. Hymns, chants, and rhythms accompanied rituals to awaken statues and welcome gods. Egyptian art is full of dancers, arms high, feet light, smiles wide. There were two main types: sacred dance, performed in temples, especially by women, often in long flowing linen and gold jewelry; social dance, for weddings, feasts, harvests, or just because the mood struck; professional dancers, sometimes enslaved women or foreign performers, entertained at nobles' homes, but ordinary folks danced too, in groups, in pairs, or in lines around a courtyard fire. And yes, children danced, always. Even funerals sometimes ended with dance, not to dishonor the dead, but to remind the living of joy. Books were rare. Papyrus was expensive, but stories were everywhere. Grandparents told tales of clever peasants outwitting greedy judges, talking animals and magical crocodiles, gods battling chaos, the misadventures of lazy scribes or boastful brothers. One favorite? The story of the shipwrecked sailor, a man who survives a wreck, meets a talking serpent, and is told, "What's meant to be, will be." Stories carried wisdom, humor, and warning. They soothed crying children and entertained drunk farmers. Sometimes they were serious, sometimes absurd, but they always bound people together. Egyptians loved a good celebration, and they had plenty. Major festivals honored Osiris, with reenactments of his death and rebirth; Hathor, with drinking, dancing, and song; Ra, especially during the summer solstice; Wepet Renpet, the New Year festival. Feasts weren't just for the elite. Even farmers gathered, shared food, drank beer, played music, and gave thanks. Imagine torches flickering, drums pounding, dancers moving through the dust, roasted duck on spits, and children trying to sneak sips of beer. For one night, even the poorest laborer might feel rich. Let's not forget self-care. Ancient Egyptians cared deeply about appearance, not out of vanity, but respect for self, others, and the gods. They spent time applying kohl eyeliner, not just stylish, but protective against glare and infection, scenting themselves with lotions, perfumed oils, incense, wearing wigs, especially for parties, using mirrors, combs, razors. A man might shave his beard. A woman might braid her hair with beads. Even servants perfumed their collars before a temple visit. Looking good wasn't just for the wealthy. It was part of feeling human. And sometimes, leisure meant nothing more than this: sitting by the Nile, feet in the water, listening to birds in the reeds, watching clouds drift above the palms, sharing bread with a friend, laughing without reason after a long day. In a world of gods, fields, and pyramids, the Egyptians knew that joy wasn't just a break from life, it was part of life. In the land of pharaohs and gods, love still bloomed like lotuses on the Nile. We tend to picture ancient Egypt as rigid, all order and incense and hierarchy, but between the rituals and the regulations lived something softer, something more human. Egyptians fell in love. They flirted, they argued, they made up, they raised children, lost sleep, worried about in-laws, and gave the last bite of bread to the one they loved. Because behind every monument carved in stone was a home built on affection. There was no formal dating, not the way we think of it, but romance. Oh yes. A young man might see a girl carrying water from the well or weaving linen in the shade. He might start showing up more often, offer her a fig, crack a joke, maybe sing. Love poems from the time are intimate, sometimes even blush-worthy. Consider this line from a lover's song. My heart flutters hastily when I think of your love. It lets me not act sensibly. It lets me not put on a dress, nor wrap my scarf around me. Sound familiar? Men courted women with words, small gifts, sometimes music, and if things went well, a family visit followed, and a future began. Here's the surprise. No big wedding ceremonies, no temples, no priests, no crowns. Marriage in Egypt was often marked by moving in together, forming a mutual agreement, and sometimes drafting a marriage contract. That contract might state property ownership, responsibilities of each partner, terms of separation should things go sour, childcare expectations. But even without the paperwork, once a man and woman lived together and were accepted as such by their neighbors, they were married. Marriage was both practical and personal, a partnership rooted in affection and duty. And despite the lack of a formal ritual, love and fidelity were valued deeply. Egyptian society was patriarchal, but surprisingly egalitarian in daily life. Men were often the primary earners, farming, crafting, working in temples or administration. Women managed the home, cooking, weaving, childcare, budgeting, even running small businesses. But women had rights. They could own property, inherit wealth, sue in court, divorce their husbands, remarry, and husbands were expected to treat their wives with respect. One scribe wrote, "Make her heart joyful as long as you live. Do not be harsh to her, for she is your companion." Not bad advice even now. Children were seen as blessings, the continuation of the family line, and an echo of divine favor. Couples often had many children, though infant mortality remained high. The first few years were all about survival, but once a child could walk and talk, they were part of daily life, helping with chores, watching younger siblings, learning the family trade. Parents taught children how to speak respectfully, how to honor gods and ancestors, how to do their share, how to dance, sing, and be generous. Discipline existed, yes, but affection was everywhere. Mothers brushing hair, fathers swinging children in play, grandparents telling stories by lamp glow. Love wasn't always easy. We have letters that show jealousy, longing, and even spats. Why have you not written to me? Have you forgotten me already? Or, I sent you figs. You did not thank me. Do you still wish for my hand? But we also see deep tenderness. Come to me, my lotus. Let us sit in the shade and watch the fish rise. Marriages sometimes ended in divorce, which was legal and respected. Both men and women could request it. Assets were divided. Children usually stayed with the mother, and life moved on, because Egyptians knew, like we do, that love is sometimes messy, but always worth the risk. Family wasn't just parents and children. It stretched across generations. Elders were revered. Grandparents helped raise children, shared stories, passed down wisdom. A household might include a couple, their children, elder parents, a sibling or two, servants or workers. Big families meant security, labor, and legacy, and everyone had a role. Elder women offered herbal remedies, advice, and warmth. Old men sat by the door, telling stories and settling disputes. A full house? That was the goal. Couples sometimes wore matching amulets, eyes of Horus for protection, hearts for unity, scarabs for renewal. Offerings at temples might be made in the name of my wife, or for the long life of my beloved husband. Even in tombs, love endured. Tomb paintings show couples holding hands, standing side by side, not one behind the other, equal, together, into eternity. In one tomb, a husband wrote, "I built this house for you, my heart's sister. We shall rest here together and rise again with the gods." If you really want to understand a society, forget the royal decrees and temple carvings for a moment. Go stand in its marketplace. There, among woven baskets and shouted prices, you find the heartbeat of everyday life. Egypt wasn't just about priests and pharaohs. It was a land of shopkeepers, herders, cobblers, boatmen, sellers of perfume and pottery, and those in between, swapping onions for sandals, bread for salt, beer for gossip. Surprising to many, for most of ancient Egyptian history, coins didn't exist. Not Egyptian ones, anyway. Instead, people used a barter economy, trading goods and services directly. There was a basic system of value referencing, not fixed currency, but informal equivalency. A sack of grain might be worth 2 jars of beer. A linen tunic might cost a basket of garlic and a chicken. A day of labor might earn a loaf of bread, a jug of beer, and some onions. Temples and estates kept track using Deben, a unit of weight, about 91 grams, to measure the value of copper, silver, or grain. But this was more like a price guide than a physical coin. And while wealthier transactions might involve metal by weight, most people traded what they had. Practical, messy, human. Every town had its market square, often near the river or temple. It wasn't neat rows of stores, more like organized chaos. Sellers squatted behind mats or baskets. Buyers wandered between stalls. Children darted between legs. Donkeys brayed, chickens squawked, flutes played. There were fresh goods, onions, dates, beans, fish still wriggling, lentils, beer, bread, and spices. There were craft goods, pots, sandals, combs, linen, coal sticks, amulets, baskets. There were services, scribes writing letters, barbers offering shaves, fortune-tellers throwing bones, even dentists pulling teeth with string and stone. No megaphones, just voices raised in the ancient language of haggling. 3 copper rings? I could give you 5 garlic bulbs, and that's generous. Bargaining wasn't rude. It was expected, a kind of social dance, and sellers had their loyal customers, while buyers had their favorite stalls. Merchants were more than market vendors. They were connectors. River traders moved goods by boat between cities. Caravan leaders took donkeys across deserts to Nubia or the Levant. Workshop agents bought raw materials and sold finished products. Temple merchants sold sacred oils, incense, and votive statues. Some grew wealthy, managing shipments of papyrus, cedar, copper, or wine. Their homes were larger. Their children might become scribes. Their wives ran textile businesses or helped track inventories with notched sticks and ostraca, pottery shards used as writing tablets. But most were just trying to make a living, to stay ahead of the next flood, the next tax, the next sawtooth. Egypt didn't run on imported marble or imperial taxes. It ran on the calloused hands of its workers, artisans and tradespeople included, potters, weavers, stone carvers, blacksmiths, jewelry makers, leather workers, coffin builders, shoemakers. They lived modestly, but proudly, in tightly packed homes near the workshops. Their tools were simple: bronze blades, bone needles, reed pens, stone hammers. But the results, timeless. Even the coffin of Tutankhamun, that dazzling gold masterpiece, began with wood, resin, and the hands of someone who may have lived just down the lane from a bread baker. Contrary to many ancient societies, Egyptian women weren't shut out of business. Women sold beer and bread in the market, managed textile production from their homes, owned shops, farms, and slave labor, appeared in contracts as lenders, partners, and debt holders, could sue over trade disputes and win. One woman, Nebet, ran a perfume business in Thebes and appears in 3 different trade records. Another, Tashariet, loaned grain to neighbors and charged interest, legally. They weren't just wives of merchants, they were merchants. Temples and officials didn't ignore this activity. They organized it. Market tolls were charged for selling in public spaces. Estate managers tracked harvest yields and issued trade quotas. Craftsmen on royal commissions, say, carving tombs, were paid in rations, not cash. Officials checked weights and measures. Dishonest sellers could be fined or banned. Trade wasn't wild and free. It was watched, because the pharaoh's coffers needed to stay full, and the priests even fuller. Still, much of the day-to-day market life was community-driven, built on trust, habit, and small favors. While most Egyptians lived and died within a few miles of home, their goods traveled far. From Nubia came gold, ivory, ostrich feathers, incense. From the Levant, cedar wood, olive oil, wine, glass beads. From Punt, possibly modern Eritrea or Somalia, myrrh, baboon monkeys, exotic animal skins. And from the Mediterranean, tin, silver, pottery. Foreign trade was elite-controlled, but every shipment fed back into daily life, a touch of imported glamour in a basket of domestic necessity. And for most people, commerce meant keeping just a head of empty. A farmer brought 2 baskets of onions to market, hoping to leave with bread and thread. A fisherman traded 6 carp for a knife sharpening. A woman sold 2 jars of beer and came home with copper to mend her husband's plough. It was informal, personal, sometimes unfair, but it worked, because at its heart, Egyptian trade was people helping people, even when they grumbled about the price. In ancient Egypt, magic wasn't fiction. It was real. It was daily. It was everywhere. To the average Egyptian, the world wasn't divided neatly between the physical and the spiritual. The gods didn't sit far away in clouds. They walked among people, in the form of wind, shadow, animals, illness, and dreams. And while priests performed high temple rituals, ordinary Egyptians practiced their own brand of household magic, small, practical, and deeply personal. You didn't need to be a sorcerer to believe. You just needed to be human, and maybe a little cautious. First, a bit of clarity. Egyptians didn't separate religion from magic the way we often do. Religion, the formal worship of gods, prayers, temple rituals, offerings. Magic, Heka, the invisible force that tied everything together, used by gods, priests, and farmers alike. Heka wasn't evil. It wasn't forbidden. It was a divine tool, gifted by the gods. Even Ra, the sun god, was said to use Heka to rise each morning, and Thoth, god of wisdom, invented the spells used in healing and resurrection. So yes, when your child had a fever, you prayed to Sekhmet, and you also burned herbs, chanted a spell, and tied a protective amulet around their wrist. Everyday Egyptians were, in many ways, superstitious survivors. Their lives were full of uncertainty, floods, famines, fevers, and they reached for meaning wherever they could find it. Here are a few beliefs you'd recognize on the street in Thebes or Memphis. Dreams had messages, especially if they featured snakes, rivers, or falling teeth. Left side itches meant a fight was coming. Hiccups meant someone was speaking ill of you. Dropping a knife was bad luck, unless it fell blade up. Then it meant a visitor. Cats weren't just pets. They were guardians against evil spirits. Spitting 3 times could undo a curse or bad omen. Red was protective. It frightened demons, but could also symbolize chaos. Complex, right? Superstition wove through daily actions, not dramatic, but constant, like carrying a lucky bead, or pausing to knock on wood, or rather, to knock on limestone. Egyptians wore amulets, like we wear headphones, everywhere, every day, and for 100 reasons. Some were made of gold. Most were carved from faience, a glazed ceramic, carnelian, lapis lazuli, or even bone. Popular designs included Eye of Horus, Wedjat, for health and protection, Ankh, symbol of life, Scarab, for rebirth and guidance, Jed Pillar, for stability and endurance, 2 fingers, to guard women in childbirth, cats, to ward off chaos, frogs, fertility and healing. People wore them around their necks, tucked them into clothing, hung them over beds, buried them with loved ones, or hid them in corners of the home. Some were blessed by priests, others were homemade, carved by a mother with a knife and a prayer. Every home had a little ritual tucked into the routine. A mother whispering charms over a sick child, a father drawing protective symbols above the door, a clay figurine buried in the threshold to keep spirits out. Incense burned not just for smell, but for cleansing. One of the most trusted protectors was Bez, the squat, lion-faced dwarf god who scared away nightmares and mischief. His image was carved onto walls, combs, and furniture, especially in places of birth, sleep, and intimacy. You wanted Bez in your house, loud, ugly, fierce, like a bouncer for bad dreams. Magic wasn't just for illness. It touched love, too. Some texts include spells to win someone's heart, keep a lover faithful, heal a broken heart, create bindings, sometimes ethically, fuzzy. A typical love charm might involve a lock of hair, a piece of clothing, a line of poetry, a figurine wrapped in red thread, then hidden under a bed, planted near a doorstep, or burned with a whispered vow. It sounds intense, and it was. Love in ancient Egypt wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual warfare. Where there was protection, there were curses too. Tombs were often inscribed with warnings, not horror movie curses exactly, but poetic threats. I will wring your neck like a goose. My spirit will haunt your house. My car will never rest. Temples sometimes recorded legal curses against thieves, false witnesses, or oath breakers. Common folks used curses too, especially if wronged in business or love. They might write the offender's name on a clay pot, smash it while cursing them aloud, burn their footprint drawn in ash, or place a written curse in the Nile, hoping it drifted into divine hands. This wasn't just spite, it was justice when other justice failed. Did Egypt have witches? Not exactly. But there were practitioners of ritual magic, sometimes called Heka workers, wise women, or sacred scribes. They knew herbs, chants, planetary alignments. They performed rituals under moonlight. Some were feared, others revered. Many were consulted in secret, and their services were wide-ranging, healing fevers, removing curses, guiding childbirth, predicting floods, finding lost objects. In rural villages, these figures held quiet power, often more trusted than distant priests. To the ancient Egyptian, life was never just physical. Every field, child, illness, or accident was wrapped in layers of meaning. If a snake entered the house, was it a pest or a messenger? If a fish leapt from the water, was it coincidence or a sign? They didn't ask, "Is it real?" They asked, "What does it mean?" Because in a world where the Nile might vanish, the crops might fail, and the gods might smile or frown without warning, you didn't just live in Egypt, you believed in it. In modern life, we think in minutes, appointments, deadlines, schedules, everything sliced thin by a ticking clock. But in ancient Egypt, time flowed. It was the murmur of the Nile as it rose and fell. It was the slow unfolding of papyrus leaves. It was the crackling of flood-baked mud beneath bare feet. And it was never rushed, just known. Egyptians didn't need watches. They had the river, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Nature was their calendar, their clock, their future teller. Let's look at how time moved in a land built to last forever. Each year began with a miracle. From roughly June to September, the Nile flooded. Not a destructive deluge, but a long, steady swell that spilled into the fields and deposited dark, rich silt, the foundation of Egypt's fertility. The season had a name, Akhet, the inundation. During this time, farming halted, fields disappeared under water. People repaired tools, made beer, visited temples, and told stories. Anticipation rose, because when the water receded, the real work began. Floods that were too low meant famine, too high, destruction, but just right, life. No wonder the Nile was seen as divine. The river was Egypt's pulse. After the waters receded, Akhet gave way to Pare, the emergence, roughly October to February. Now the race began. Ploughs were drawn by oxen or by hand. Seeds, wheat, barley, flax, lentils were cast into the moist soil. Men, women, and children planted, tended, and prayed. Workers sang to keep pace, and festivals were held to bless the soil. This season was one of hope, a gamble on the gods, the sun, and the unseen workings of the earth. And it shaped everything, from temple schedules to marriage plans to tax calendars. Then came Shimu, the harvest, roughly March to May. The river was low, the sun was high, the crops were ready. Sickles made of wood and flint were used to reap. Grains were gathered, threshed, and winnowed by hand. Taxes were collected, often in grain. Scribes recorded totals, temple workers stored surplus, and farmers celebrated or mourned, depending on yield. This was a season of reckoning. Did your gamble pay off? Did the gods favor your field? Did you have enough to eat or enough to trade? A good harvest meant stability. A poor one, anxiety. Or worse, famine. Egyptians used several overlapping calendars. A civil calendar of 12 months, 30 days each, with 5 extra feast days, 365 total. A lunar calendar for festivals and sacred rituals. A seasonal calendar based on the Nile and agriculture. The rising of the star Sirius, Sopdet, in the early morning sky signaled the beginning of Akhet, the new year. It was so precise, they used it for centuries, long before mechanical clocks. Temples tracked celestial movements. Farmers watched shadows on stones. Time was observed, not owned. There were no hours or minutes, but Egyptians marked the day carefully. Dawn began the day, symbolizing rebirth. Midday was sacred, Ra at his strongest. Evening was when gods rested, and so did the people. Time was tracked with sundials, shadow clocks, a stick or bar to read light angles, water clocks, slow dripping vessels with internal marks. Time wasn't about productivity, it was about alignment, with nature, with divine cycles, with community. And if something didn't get done today, there was always tomorrow, or the next flood. Egyptians saw the natural world not just as background, but as alive, full of signs, meanings, and personalities. A frog was fertility. A falcon was vision and power. A lotus was rebirth, blooming new each day from the muddy depths. A sunset wasn't just light fading, it was Ra's journey through the underworld, a daily reminder of death and return. Nature taught patience, reverence, and rhythm, and it wasn't passive. It spoke, in droughts, in floodlines, in patterns of migrating birds. To live well in Egypt was to listen. Egyptians didn't count birthdays the way we do, not every year anyway. Age was measured more by phases of life. Childhood, before the work began. Apprenticeship, learning a skill or trade. Householder, married, working. Elder, advisor, memory keeper, voice of experience. Time wasn't feared. Old age was honored. Wrinkles meant stories. Limping steps meant wisdom. And though few lived past their 40s or 50s, those who did were treasured, consulted, loved. Egyptians didn't just see time as a line, beginning to end. They saw it as a loop, a cycle. Just as the sun died each night and was reborn at dawn, so too was the soul expected to journey through darkness and emerge again, transformed. This belief shaped everything, how they lived, what they valued, how they farmed, prayed, ate, worked, and raised children. Because every moment, every season, echoed eternity, and in the shifting sands and silver starlight, they trusted what has been will be again, what dies will rise, and the Nile always will return. Not everyone in ancient Egypt had their name carved in stone. In fact, most didn't. No statues, no tomb inscriptions, no golden funerary masks or scrolls filled with prayers to guide their souls into the next world. And yet, without these people, there would have been no Egypt at all, because behind every towering obelisk was a quarry worker who swung a hammer in the heat. Behind every royal feast, a field laborer who tilled, sowed, and reaped. Behind every painted tomb, a mother who cleaned her child's scraped knees and whispered blessings at bedtime. The majority of ancient Egyptians were what we might now call the working poor. Farmers, fishermen, bricklayers, porters, cleaners, midwives, pot sellers, linen beaters, reed cutters, water haulers. They lived in mudbrick homes, slept on reed mats, ate onion stew, wore homespun linen, and walked to fields before dawn with baskets on their backs and prayers on their lips. They didn't leave memoirs. They didn't shape policy. They shaped the land, and the land remembered. Surprisingly little. A few scribbles on ostraca, pottery shards, some tools, faint footprints in drying bricks, bits of carved graffiti on quarry walls. In the workers' village of el-Medina, we find glimpses, notes from a tired artisan asking for time off due to illness, a husband apologizing to his wife after a fight, a woman writing down her dreams to share with the village wise woman. It's humble stuff, but in these fragments we hear something profound. They mattered to each other. Even if the pharaoh never knew their names, these people fed the gods, built the temples, raised the crops, mended the boats, carried the dead, raised children, taught skills, sang songs no one ever wrote down. Every grand monument was made with their sweat. Every dynasty stood on their backs. Every noble's robe woven by their hands. They held Egypt together, not by command, but by consistency, by rising every day and doing the thing that needed to be done, whether anyone noticed or not. We sometimes assume ancient laborers lived dull, empty lives. They didn't. Their lives were filled with music, laughter, romance, sorrow, ritual, hope, prayer, beer, arguments, soft moments under starlight. They looked up at the same stars, wondered the same things about life and death, and told their children the same calming lies we still do today. It's going to be okay. Maybe this is the real reason their stories matter, because the field worker from 3,000 years ago, she's not that different from the vendor in a modern Cairo street, or the farmer in rural Texas, or the bus driver in Seoul, or the baker in Naples, or you, or me. We live quiet lives. We don't build pyramids, but we build families, meals, memories, and that too is legacy, because every civilization is made up of a handful of rulers and millions of hands, because our stories, even the unwritten ones, matter, and because sometimes the most powerful monument isn't a temple. It's a shared loaf of bread, a laugh at sunset, a lesson passed from mother to child. Their names may be lost, but their presence, their humanity, it echoes still. As we leave this ancient land of sand and shadow, temples and tombs, we don't carry away the voice of a god or a king. We carry the rhythm of a loom weaving linen before dawn, the smell of barley beer simmering in clay jars, the smile of a boy running barefoot along an irrigation ditch, the soft voice of a woman singing while grinding grain. Ordinary moments, lived by ordinary people, that somehow, across thousands of years, still reach us. And maybe that's what Egypt was in the end. Not just a kingdom of gods and gold, but a home. One built by hands like ours, and hearts like ours, still beating, still remembered, even in the silence.